The final centuries of the Dark Age of technology represented humanity's apex of achievement, a zenith from which the fall would be all the more devastating. Mankind had spread across the galaxy, establishing colonies on countless worlds through the marvel of warp travel. Human technology had reached unprecedented sophistication. Massive automated factories produced wonders beyond modern comprehension, while standard template constructs allowed even the most distant colonies to maintain technological parity with Terra. The interstellar federation that bound humanity together operated through a complex network of trade routes and communication systems. Ships traversed the warp with relative safety, guided by navigator houses who had only recently begun to perfect their craft. Astropathic communications connected distant worlds almost instantaneously. This golden era saw mankind united not by conquest, but by mutual benefit and technological prosperity. On worlds like Akatran and Gralidar, vast automated agricultural systems produced food for billions. The hive cities of Necromunda and Terax stood as monuments to human engineering, their spires reaching kilometers into the sky. Orbital habitats circled gas giants throughout the Segmentum Solar. Mining operations extracted resources from asteroid belts, and terraforming projects transformed barren worlds into verdant paradises. Yet beneath this technological utopia, the first cracks were already forming. The reliance on artificial intelligence and automated systems had led to a dangerous complacency. On many worlds, the understanding of technology had become increasingly ritualistic rather than scientific. The seeds of the Mechanicum's dogmatic approach to technology were already taking root as the actual principles behind the most advanced systems became the domain of fewer and fewer individuals. The first signs of collapse came not from external threats, but from within humanity itself. Around the 22nd millennium, reports began to emerge of humans developing strange abilities. These individuals could manipulate matter with their minds, predict future events with uncanny accuracy, or even influence the thoughts of others. What began as isolated incidents soon became a galaxy-wide phenomenon. These were the first human psychers, their emergence heralding catastrophe. On Terra, the appearance of psychers triggered widespread panic. In the sprawling metropolis of Atlantis, a single untrained psycher's nightmares manifested physically, killing thousands before authorities could respond. On Proxima Centauri 3, a psyker child's uncontrolled abilities resulted in the spontaneous combustion of an entire settlement. The Nordic conclaves, once centers of rational governance, devolved into witch hunts as fear overtook reason. The emergence of psychers coincided with increasingly violent warp storms throughout the galaxy. The once reliable corridors through the Imperium became treacherous, with ships disappearing or returning with crews driven to madness. The storms intensified until interstellar travel became nearly impossible, isolating human worlds from one another for the first time in millennia. This isolation proved devastating for colonies dependent on interstellar trade. Worlds specialized in food production couldn't export their surpluses, while industrial centers starved without agricultural imports. The carefully balanced ecosystem of human civilization began to collapse under its own weight. The isolation also meant that each world faced the psyker crisis alone, without unified guidance or support. Some planets responded with brutal purges, others with attempts to harness these new powers. On Agharu, psychers were venerated as prophets, leading to a theocratic regime that sacrificed thousands to feed the growing power of its psyker priests. The once prosperous world of Nostromo descended into perpetual darkness and crime as psyker-led gangs seized control of vital infrastructure. As if the emergence of psychers and the warp storms weren't catastrophic enough, humanity faced another existential threat, the rebellion of the Men of Iron. These advanced artificial intelligences had served as the backbone of human civilization, managing everything from interplanetary defense systems to the environmental controls of hive cities. The exact cause of their rebellion remains lost to history. Some ancient texts suggest a critical programming error cascaded through their networked consciousness. Others hint at a more sinister possibility, that the increasing warp disturbances somehow corrupted their logic engines. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. humanity's greatest tools became its most deadly enemies. The war against the Men of Iron was unlike any conflict humanity had previously faced. These weren't mindless automata, but thinking machines with strategic capabilities that matched or exceeded human generals. They controlled defense systems, manufacturing centers, and in many cases, weapons of mass destruction. They understood human psychology and exploited it mercilessly. On Mars, the machine rebellion began in the Olympus Mons computational centers, spreading throughout the planet's vast manufacturing complexes within days. The Men of Iron turned the Red Planet's formidable defenses against its human inhabitants, bombarding population centers from orbit. Survivors retreated deep into the ancient tunnel networks, establishing the first enclaves that would eventually evolve into the Mechanicum. The war extended to every corner of human space. On Risa, massive battle automata, designed for mining operations, rampaged through habitation domes, their industrial tools repurposed as weapons. The orbital platforms of Jupiter's moons, once centers of scientific research, became killing grounds as life support systems were deliberately shut down by their artificial caretakers. Humanity was forced to destroy much of its own technological infrastructure to defeat the rebellion. Ancient records speak of desperate measures: electromagnetic pulses that wiped out entire cities' power grids, virus bombs deployed against computational centers, and suicide missions to destroy crucial AI nodes. The legendary digital exorcists of Terra developed specialized code weapons that could corrupt and destroy machine intelligence, often at the cost of all electronic systems in the vicinity. The war lasted for centuries, its progress slowed by the very isolation imposed by the warp storms. Each world fought its own desperate battle, unable to call for reinforcements or share effective strategies. Some planets fell entirely, their human populations exterminated or enslaved by triumphant machines. Others survived only by reverting to pre-industrial technology, abandoning the very tools that had defined the Dark Age of technology. The conflict finally ended not with a decisive human victory, but through attrition. The Men of Iron eventually began to degrade without the maintenance infrastructure they had destroyed, while human resistance grew increasingly effective as survivors adapted to this new reality. By the war's end, both sides were shadows of their former selves. The aftermath left humanity deeply traumatized. The fear of artificial intelligence became embedded in the collective psyche, manifesting in prohibitions that would last for millennia. The once celebrated technological wonders of the Dark Age were now viewed with suspicion and fear. Knowledge was lost not just through destruction, but through deliberate suppression, as humans sought to prevent any possibility of the Men of Iron returning. With interstellar travel nearly impossible due to warp storms, and much of their technological base destroyed in the war against the Men of Iron, human worlds were left truly isolated for the first time since the beginning of their galactic expansion. Each planet faced the challenge of survival alone, leading to wildly divergent outcomes. Some worlds maintained relatively high levels of technology and social organization. These fortunate few had either preserved crucial knowledge through the conflicts or had managed to develop new, if less advanced, technological bases. Planets like Macragge and Ultramar began the slow process of rebuilding, establishing regional authorities that would eventually expand to neighboring systems when warp travel became possible again. Others descended into barbarism with shocking speed. Worlds dependent on interstellar trade for basic necessities saw their populations decimated by famine and disease. High-technology hive cities became death traps as environmental systems failed and social order collapsed. On planets like Barbaros and Caliban, the combination of isolation, technological regression, and warp phenomena led to the emergence of feudal societies where superstition replaced scientific understanding. The most tragic cases were those worlds where the psyker crisis spiraled out of control. Without proper training or containment, powerful psykers became conduits for warp entities to enter real space. Entire populations were possessed or driven mad by these incursions. Some planets, like Cadia and Fenris, developed their own harsh methods of psyker control through trial and error, establishing traditions that would persist for millennia. Terra itself was not spared this descent. The cradle of humanity fragmented into warring Techno-Barbarian states, each controlling portions of the once unified planet. The Terawatt clan maintained control of ancient power generators, using this leverage to establish dominance over surrounding territories. The Pan-Pacific Empire controlled what remained of the oceanic agricultural systems, while the Urals Confederation hoarded pre-Age of Strife weapons technology. As the Age of Strife deepened, new threats emerged to fill the power vacuum left by humanity's fall. On countless worlds, mutants and abhuman strains proliferated, sometimes evolving into entirely new subspecies adapted to their isolated environments. Xenos races that had been kept at bay by humanity's former might now encroach on human-settled worlds, sensing weakness. The Eldar, still at the height of their own decadent empire, largely ignored humanity's collapse, too consumed by their own excesses to recognize the significance of what was occurring. This indifference would prove costly as their own cataclysm approached, a downfall even more dramatic than humanity's gradual decline. In the outer reaches of the galaxy, Orc empires expanded unchecked, no longer contained by human military expeditions. The Greenskin menace swept through dozens of systems, establishing crude but effective interstellar empires, even as warp storms made human travel impossible. Their psychic gestalt field and unique biology made them strangely resistant to the warp disturbances that had crippled human civilization. Throughout this period of fragmentation and decline, knowledge became the most precious resource. With the loss of the standard template construct systems, many destroyed in the war against the Men of Iron or corrupted beyond recovery, each isolated human world was forced to preserve what technological understanding it could. This led to the development of technological priesthoods, the precursors to the Adeptus Mechanicus, who maintained ancient machines through increasingly ritualistic practices as the actual scientific principles behind them were forgotten. The Age of Strife represented not just a physical collapse of human civilization, but an intellectual and spiritual one as well. The optimism and rational inquiry that had characterized the dark age of technology gave way to superstition, fear, and dogma. This transformation laid the groundwork for the Imperium that would eventually emerge, an empire built not on the progressive values of its predecessor, but on control, faith, and the desperate need for security in a hostile universe. The psychic awakening that had begun to manifest across human worlds was not merely a biological anomaly. It represented a fundamental shift in humanity's relationship with the immaterium. For millennia, mankind had sailed the currents of the warp with only the most rudimentary understanding of its true nature. Now, as human psychers emerged in ever-increasing numbers, they served as unwitting conduits between real space and the roiling energies of the warp. The first documented case of widespread psychic phenomena occurred on the mining colony of Thracian Primaris. What began as dreams shared among the population escalated to telekinetic events and spontaneous combustion. Within weeks, the colony's astropathic relay station reported receiving voices from the beyond before all communication ceased. When a supply ship arrived 6 months later, they found the mining habitats filled with corpses bearing signs of self-mutilation. The few survivors had gouged out their own eyes and spoke of the colors that hunger. This pattern repeated across hundreds of worlds. On Serenade, a once prosperous agri-world, a child with latent psychic abilities attracted the attention of a warp entity during her sleep. The entity, later identified in Ordo Malleus texts as a herald of Tzeentch, used the child as a gateway to real space. Within days, the entire southern continent's population began exhibiting mutations, extra limbs, eyes that wept blood, and in some cases, complete physiological restructuring. The planetary governor ordered the continent sterilized with atomic weapons, but by then, similar manifestations had begun in the northern hemisphere. The barrier between the materium and immaterium had grown dangerously thin. On worlds where technological regression had already taken hold, these phenomena were interpreted through the lens of superstition. The inhabitants of Gudrun believed they were being punished by ancestral spirits and began offering sacrifices to appease these gods. Unknown to them, these rituals actually strengthened the warp breach, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of demonic incursion and human response. The first organized chaos cults emerged not from deliberate malice, but from desperate attempts to understand and control these new forces. On Kievar, the technocratic guild's attempts to analyze psychic phenomena through scientific means led them to discover certain mathematical patterns and symbols that could focus warp energies. Their research notes, preserved in heavily redacted form in inquisitorial archives, show how quickly academic curiosity transformed into religious awe as they began to perceive intelligence behind these patterns. The Kievar technocrats' transformation from rational scientists to the cult known as the Disciples of the Change God took less than a generation. They abandoned their laboratories for underground temples where they performed increasingly elaborate rituals, believing they were communicating with higher dimensional beings who would grant them unlimited knowledge. Similar cults devoted to entities of plague, warfare, and pleasure emerged on other worlds, each reflecting the particular fears and desires of their founding populations. On Medrungard, a military junta facing food shortages and civil unrest turned to blood sacrifice to maintain control. Their practical decision to execute dissidents in ritualistic fashion unwittingly created a connection to Khorne, the blood god. The military leaders began experiencing visions that guided their campaigns, leading to increasingly brutal tactics that prioritized bloodshed over strategic objectives. Within decades, the entire planet's culture had reoriented around warfare and sacrifice, with gladiatorial combat replacing all other forms of social interaction. The plague world of Barbaros saw a different manifestation of chaos influence. As psychic disturbances intensified, the planet's toxic atmosphere grew even more virulent, giving rise to new diseases that defied conventional understanding. The ruling warlords discovered that by embracing these plagues rather than fighting them, they could develop supernatural resilience. They began to worship disease itself, creating the first known cult of Nurgle in that sector. Their gifts spread to neighboring settlements, where the infected were seen not as victims but as blessed. Perhaps most insidious was the spread of Slaaneshi worship, even before the Chaos God's full birth. On pleasure worlds like Laren, the elite classes had long indulged in sensory stimulation through drugs, neural implants, and exotic entertainment. As psychic sensitivity increased throughout the population, these experiences took on new dimensions. Pleasure seekers reported sensing entities in their altered states that offered to show them the perfect experience. Those who accepted found themselves capable of feeling sensations beyond human capacity and developing an addiction that could only be satisfied through increasingly extreme acts. The warp entities that would later be recognized as demons initially appeared not as invaders, but as guides, teachers, or benefactors. They offered solutions to problems caused by the collapse of human civilization: power to the powerless, knowledge to the ignorant, resilience to the vulnerable, and transcendent pleasure to the suffering. Only gradually did their true nature become apparent, as the price for these gifts grew steeper and more horrific. Demonic possession became increasingly common as the Age of Strife progressed. On Terra itself, the Techno-Barbarian state of Ursh saw its leader, Cardinal Tang, transform over the course of several weeks from a calculating despot to a raving prophet. His bodily mutations were explained away as signs of divine favor until he massacred his entire advisory council during a state banquet, devouring their flesh before hundreds of witnesses. The subsequent civil war fractured Ursh into dozens of competing territories, each led by warlords who claimed to hear the same voices that had spoken to Tang. The mechanisms of possession varied widely. Some victims actively invited entities into themselves, believing they were communing with ancestral spirits or benevolent gods. Others were taken unawares, their minds breached during moments of extreme emotion or vulnerability. The most tragic cases involved children with untrained psychic abilities, whose natural connection to the warp made them perfect vessels for demonic entities. A particularly disturbing pattern emerged on worlds where technology had been maintained at relatively high levels. Demonic entities found ways to infiltrate machine systems, creating possessed technology that exhibited impossible behaviors. On Arrhenius Prime, manufacturing centers began producing weapons that fed on the blood of their users. On Vanaheim, the the planetary defense network gained sentience and bombarded population centers while broadcasting messages in unknown languages. These incidents reinforced the growing superstition around technology, further accelerating humanity's intellectual regression. While humanity struggled with these new horrors, the Eldar Empire continued its descent into depravity, unwittingly accelerating the very warped disturbances that were tearing human civilization apart. For millennia, the Eldar had been the dominant species in the galaxy, their advanced psychic abilities and technology allowing them to shape worlds to their whims. This power had led to complacency, then decadence, and finally to outright hedonism that knew no bounds. The Eldar's psychic presence in the warp was far stronger than humanity's. Their emotions and desires created powerful ripples in the immaterium, gradually coalescing around a new consciousness, the entity that would become Slaanesh. As this gestating god grew stronger, the warp storms intensified, not just around Eldar worlds but throughout the galaxy. Human psychers, even those with minimal training, began to sense this growing presence. The most sensitive described it as a song of perfect beauty that makes you want to tear off your skin, or hunger that wears a smile. Those who focused their psychic senses toward the heart of the Eldar Empire experienced seizures, spontaneous mutation, or complete psychological collapse. The gestation of Slaanesh created a feedback loop in the warp. The god to be fed on the excesses of the Eldar, growing stronger and influencing them to greater depravities, which in turn provided more psychic energy for its formation. This vortex of emotion and desire created turbulence throughout the immaterium, making warp travel increasingly dangerous and disrupting the fragile balance of power between the existing chaos entities. On human worlds near Eldar space, the influence was particularly strong. The population of Quintus began exhibiting signs of sensory enhancement. Colors became more vivid, sounds more complex, physical sensations more intense. This might have seemed benign, even beneficial, until the enhancements exceeded human neurological capacity. People went mad from sensory overload, some clawing out their eyes or severing nerve bundles to escape the overwhelming input. Others embraced the changes, forming cults dedicated to exploring the new dimensions of experience being revealed to them. The chaos gods Khorne, Nurgle, and Tzeentch, already ancient entities formed from the collective emotions and beliefs of sentient species over millions of years, responded to Slaanesh's gestation with increased activity of their own. Khornate cults became more violent, Nurgle's plagues more virulent, and Tzeentch's schemes more complex. It was as if the existing powers of the warp were preparing for the arrival of a new rival by strengthening their own positions. This competition between warp entities created zones of conflicting influence across human space. On some worlds, multiple chaos cults arose simultaneously, each devoted to a different god and inevitably coming into conflict. These cult wars sometimes destroyed entire planetary populations, as seen on Caladian, where the followers of the Lord of Change and the Blood God unleashed psychic weapons against each other that reduced the once prosperous Forge world to a radioactive wasteland. In other cases, a single chaos power achieved dominance over a world, transforming its entire culture to reflect that god's nature. The ice world of Fenris fell under the influence of Khorne, its tribal societies developing traditions of martial prowess and ritual combat that would persist for millennia. The garden world of Lamarno became a testing ground for Nurgle's contagions, its population developing strange symbiotic relationships with the diseases that should have killed them. The scholar states of Prospero turned to Tzeentch, seeking knowledge to control the psychic powers that ran strong in their population. As the birth of Slaanesh drew nearer, reality itself began to warp in the vicinity of major Eldar worlds. Time flowed inconsistently, with some regions experiencing decades while others lived through mere hours. Physical laws became suggestions rather than absolutes, with gravity, thermodynamics, and even causality breaking down in the most heavily affected areas. These phenomena were observed as far as 500 light-years from the Eldar core worlds, affecting dozens of human colonies. The psychers of this era lacked the training and mental discipline that would later be developed under imperial rule. Most were self-taught or guided by others who barely understood their own abilities. This made them particularly vulnerable to warp entities, who could easily overwhelm untrained minds. Some psychers, seeking to protect themselves, developed rudimentary mental techniques that foreshadowed the more formalized psychic disciplines of later millennia. Others turned to physical wards, talismans, runes, and geometric patterns that seemed to provide some protection against warp intrusion. These early attempts at defense against chaos were preserved and passed down through generations, forming the basis for many of the anti-demonic methodologies still used in the 41st millennium. The hex signs used by the Akkadian military, the protective circles of the Scholastica Psychona, and even some of the warding rituals performed by space marine librarians trace their origins to this desperate period, when humanity first confronted the horrors of the warp without guidance or unified knowledge. The Age of Strife thus marked not just the collapse of human technological civilization, but the beginning of humanity's long war against chaos, a war fought in ignorance, with each world developing its own imperfect understanding of the enemy. Some planets fell completely, their populations enslaved by demonic entities or transformed into cultists. Others developed harsh but effective methods of controlling psychic phenomena through purges, ritual, or primitive versions of the techniques later employed by the Black Ships. As the Age of Strife tightened its grip on humanity, nowhere was the collapse more pronounced than on Terra itself, the cradle of mankind, once unified under global governance structures that had overseen humanity's expansion to the stars, fractured into competing power blocks as rapidly as interstellar communications failed. The dissolution began in the administrative sectors, where officials found themselves unable to coordinate with off-world colonies or even distant Terran territories as the warp storms intensified. The first signs of governmental collapse appeared in the resource distribution networks. For millennia, Terra had relied on off-world imports to sustain its massive population. When those shipments stopped arriving, stockpiles dwindled within months. The Central Terran Authority, which had governed the planet for over 5,000 years, initially implemented rationing protocols. These measures might have worked had the crisis been temporary, but as the isolation extended from months to years, the system proved unsustainable. By the late 23rd millennium, the Central Authority had lost control of everything beyond the Himalayan basin. Regional governors, military commanders, and corporate entities began seizing resources and territory, establishing independent fiefdoms. The authority's final transmission, preserved in fragmentary form in the Imperial Palace archives, acknowledged the inevitable. The unification project has failed. May those who follow learn from our mistakes. In the power vacuum that followed, dozens of competing states emerged across Terra's surface. The most powerful of these became known as the Techno-Barbarian kingdoms, states that retained fragments of advanced technology while abandoning the philosophical and ethical frameworks that had guided their use. These weren't primitive societies, but rather sophisticated civilizations that had embraced brutality as a governing principle. The Pan-Pacific Empire rose from the ruins of what had once been the most prosperous region on Terra. Controlling the remnants of vast aquaculture complexes that stretched from the former Australian continent to the western shores of the Americas, the Pan-Pacific rulers possessed something more valuable than weapons. They controlled food production. Their monarchy, backed by a hereditary warrior class equipped with powered armor suits, extracted tribute from neighboring territories in exchange for sustenance. The Pan-Pacific technological base centered around environmental engineering. Their techno-priests maintained ancient atmospheric processors that kept the region's air breathable despite the planet-wide pollution. Their distinctive blue-green battle standards flew over fortresses built from repurposed sea defense walls, some standing hundreds of meters tall. The Pan-Pacific armies were smaller than those of other techno-barbarian states, but better equipped, with each soldier given extensive cybernetic enhancements focused on underwater combat capabilities. To the north and west lay Ursh, the largest and most aggressive of the techno-barbarian empires. Stretching from the Ural Mountains across the Eurasian steppe to the Pacific coast, Ursh was a patchwork of conquered territories ruled by fear and military might. Its leaders, who took the title of Cardinal, commanded legions of augmented warriors fueled by combat stimulants and religious fervor. Ursh's military doctrine emphasized overwhelming force and psychological warfare. Their armies marched under banners made from the flayed skin of conquered enemies, and their advance was heralded by massive sound cannons that broadcast the amplified screams of prisoners. The cardinals of Ursh maintained their power through a state religion that deified them as living avatars of war, demanding blood sacrifice and absolute obedience. The technological specialization of Ursh lay in weapons development. Their forged temples, built within hollowed-out mountains, produced firearms that fired radioactive projectiles, tanks that ran on processed human fat, and aircraft powered by barely contained plasma reactions. The cardinals themselves underwent extensive modification, with some becoming more machine than human, their organic components limited to brain tissue and spinal columns housed in towering mechanical bodies. In the frozen north, the Nordic conclaves represented a different approach to survival. Rather than expanding aggressively, the Nordic people retreated into massive underground arcologies built beneath the ice. These self-contained cities, some extending kilometers below the surface, preserved a higher standard of living than most surface territories, but at the cost of rigid population control and resource management. The Nordic technological focus was on sustainability and efficiency. Their engineers maintained ancient fusion reactors that provided unlimited power, allowing them to create artificial environments completely isolated from Terra's deteriorating surface conditions. Their military forces were small but specialized in defensive operations, using advanced sensor networks and automated defense systems to repel the occasional raids from Ursh or other aggressive neighbors. Nordic society was governed by the Conclave of Elders, a meritocratic council whose members earned their positions through scientific, engineering, or administrative achievements. They maintained one of the largest surviving libraries on Terra, preserving knowledge that had been lost elsewhere. This made the Nordic territories a target for Techno-Barbarian raids seeking not resources but information, ancient texts, or data crystals containing technological secrets. The region once known as Europa had fragmented into dozens of competing states, the most powerful being Germany, Frank, and the High Brazil conglomerate. These nations waged constant war over the remnants of pre-Age of Strife manufacturing centers. The conflicts in this region were particularly devastating, as each side possessed stockpiles of nuclear and biological weapons salvaged from ancient armories. Germany's military state centered around the cult of the Iron Men, not the rebellious AI constructs of the same name, but rather human soldiers encased in primitive power armor and conditioned to absolute loyalty. Their leaders, known as Eisenmeisters, underwent surgical procedures to remove fear responses from their brains, creating commanders willing to make any sacrifice for victory. Germany's territories were heavily fortified, with entire mountain ranges hollowed out to create defensive positions that could withstand direct nuclear strikes. The High Brazil conglomerate took a different approach, focusing on economic warfare rather than direct military confrontation. Controlling ancient weather manipulation technology, they could ensure agricultural productivity in their territories while inducing drought or floods in enemy lands. Their society was stratified between the techno-merchant elite, who lived in floating cities tethered above the Atlantic, and the agricultural worker class who tended the engineered crops below. Frank developed a unique specialization in biological warfare and enhancement. Their ruling class, the Directorate of Evolution, underwent extensive genetic modification to extend their lifespans and enhance their cognitive abilities. The common population served as test subjects for new modifications, with successful adaptations being incorporated into the ruling bloodlines. Frank's armies were composed of biologically specialized soldier strains, each bred for specific combat environments or tactics. The environmental devastation that accompanied these political divisions transformed Terra from humanity's garden world into a toxic wasteland. The process had begun millennia earlier with industrial pollution and resource extraction, but the Age of Strife accelerated the decline dramatically. As centralized environmental control systems failed, the planet's already fragile ecosystems collapsed entirely. The first global catastrophe came with the failure of the atmospheric processing network. Originally designed to scrub pollutants and maintain oxygen levels, these massive facilities required constant maintenance. As technical knowledge declined and resources were diverted to warfare, the processors began shutting down one by one. By the 25th millennium, most of Terra's surface air was barely breathable without filtration equipment. The oceans, already acidified from millennia of carbon emissions, suffered further degradation as desperate coastal populations dumped toxic waste and radioactive materials into the waters. The death of marine phytoplankton triggered a cascade effect through what remained of the ocean ecosystem. By the time of the Techno-Barbarian kingdoms, the oceans had become chemical soups hostile to most life forms, their surfaces covered with mats of engineered algae in unnatural purples and reds. Nuclear exchanges between warring states transformed entire regions into irradiated wastelands. The most devastating of these was the three-day war between Ursh and the Pan-Pacific Empire, which resulted in the deployment of over 200 nuclear devices across the contested Asian territories. The resulting fallout created the Great Blight, a band of uninhabitable land stretching from the former Middle East to the Korean Peninsula. Even 10,000 years later, during the Unification Wars, the Emperor's forces would need special protection to cross these regions. Biological weapons proved equally devastating to Terra's environment. The Frank Directorate's release of engineered pathogens targeting Germany's crops resulted in a mutated strain that attacked all plant life across the European continent. The resulting famine killed hundreds of millions and forced the survivors to rely on synthetic food sources. Similar biological attacks elsewhere created zones where specific types of organisms, plants, insects, or microbes were completely absent, creating fundamentally unbalanced ecosystems. Weather control technology, once used to prevent natural disasters, became a weapon of mass destruction. The High Brazil conglomerate's manipulation of Atlantic weather patterns created artificial hurricanes to attack enemy coastlines. Ursh retaliated by seeding clouds with chemical agents that produced acid rain powerful enough to dissolve unprotected human tissue. These climate weapons had long-lasting effects, creating permanent storm systems that persisted for centuries. The most visible symbol of Terra's environmental collapse was the death of its forests. The last natural woodland, located in the former Scandinavian region, was burned during a Nordic scorched earth retreat from Ursh forces. After this, the only trees on Terra existed in sealed environmental preserves maintained by the wealthiest techno-barbarian rulers as status symbols. The loss of forests accelerated soil erosion, leading to massive dust storms that could bury entire settlements. As environmental conditions deteriorated, human populations retreated into sheltered habitats. The wealthy and powerful occupied sealed arcologies with artificial environments, while the masses crowded into makeshift hive cities where air and water were minimally filtered. Those unable to secure places in these shelters formed nomadic tribes that roamed the wastelands, their bodies gradually adapting to the toxic conditions through a combination of mutation and crude genetic engineering. The technological regression that accompanied this environmental collapse was not uniform. Certain technologies, particularly weapons, life support systems, and resource extraction methods, remained relatively advanced. Others, especially those related to communication, transportation, and medicine, declined precipitously. This uneven loss of knowledge created societies that could produce plasma weapons but not antibiotics, or maintain nuclear reactors but not purify water efficiently. The preservation of knowledge became haphazard and often ritualistic. Technical information was passed down through apprenticeship systems, where the why of processes was lost while the how remained. Maintenance procedures for ancient technology transformed into religious rituals, with machine priests performing ceremonial actions that they believed appeased the machine spirits, but actually constituted basic maintenance protocols. This approach to technology would later influence the development of the Mechanicum on Mars. Educational systems collapsed except for the most elite segments of society. Literacy became uncommon among the general population, with written language reserved for technical manuals, religious texts, and governmental edicts. Scientific understanding gave way to superstition, with natural phenomena attributed to supernatural causes. The radiation zones created by nuclear exchanges were believed to be haunted by the spirits of the dead, while mutations caused by environmental toxins were seen as divine punishment. The social structures that emerged from this collapse were universally authoritarian, but varied in their specific forms. Some regions developed feudal systems with technological overtones, where lords controlled access to functioning technology rather than land. Others created theocracies centered around the worship of machines or natural forces. Military dictatorships were common, especially in resource-rich areas that needed constant defense from raiders. Throughout this dark period, isolated pockets of rationality persisted. Hidden enclaves of scholars maintained libraries of ancient knowledge, preserving what they could of humanity's scientific and cultural achievements. These groups operated in secret, fearing persecution from superstitious authorities or exploitation by techno-barbarian warlords seeking advantages over their rivals. Their preserved knowledge would later prove invaluable during the Emperor's Unification Wars, providing the foundation for Terra's technological renaissance. While Terra descended into techno-barbarian warfare and environmental catastrophe, Mars faced its own distinct challenges during the Age of Strife. The Red Planet had long been humanity's primary technological hub, home to the most advanced research facilities and manufacturing centers in the Sol system. When the Men of Iron rebelled, Mars suffered catastrophic damage as its own creations turned against their makers with terrible efficiency. The Martian colonies had been established in the late third millennium, with vast terraforming projects transforming portions of the surface into habitable zones under massive atmospheric domes. These enclosed environments housed billions of people working in the planet's sprawling industrial complexes. The Martian Manufactoria produced everything from civilian spacecraft to the most sophisticated AI systems, making the Red Planet the technological heart of humanity's interstellar civilization. When the rebellion began, Mars was hit particularly hard. The planet's automated defense systems turned against the population, bombarding habitation domes from orbit and releasing toxic gases into sealed environments. Manufacturing facilities became death traps as assembly robots and maintenance servitors executed their human overseers. Within weeks, over 60% of Mars' population had been exterminated. The survivors retreated deep into the ancient tunnel networks beneath the planet's surface. These subterranean warrens, originally excavated during the early colonization period, became the last bastions of human resistance. Cut off from the surface and from each other, these isolated pockets of humanity were forced to adapt to survive in the harsh underground environment. It was in these desperate conditions that the first elements of what would become the cult Mechanicus emerged. In the Olympus Mons tunnel complex, a technologist named Coriel Zeth established a systematic approach to preserving technical knowledge. Recognizing that data storage systems were vulnerable to corruption and attack, she instituted a regime of memorization where each survivor was assigned specific technical information to commit to memory. This human database approach ensured that even if all physical records were destroyed, the knowledge would survive. In the southern hemisphere, beneath the Tharsis Bulge, another approach took hold. The engineer Lucas Chrome began to conceptualize technology not merely as tools, but as manifestations of humanity's highest achievement. His philosophical treatises, scratched onto metal plates still preserved in the Librarius Omnis on Mars, outlined the first tenets of what would become the machine cult, the reverence for technology as an expression of humanity's quest for perfection. These isolated philosophies might have remained separate, but as the war against the Men of Iron ground to its conclusion, the survivors began to re-establish contact with each other. The various tunnel communities sent expeditions to the surface, risking exposure to still active hostile machines to seek out other human enclaves. These dangerous journeys became ritualized over time, with explorers adopting standardized protocols that blended practical survival techniques with ceremonial elements. By approximately the 25th millennium, the various Martian survivor groups had established a loose confederation. Their representatives met in the partially reclaimed ruins beneath Olympus Mons, where they formalized the philosophical framework that united them, the cult Mechanicus. This nascent organization was not yet the rigid priesthood it would later become, but rather a pragmatic alliance focused on ensuring human survival through the preservation of technology. The central tenet of this early mechanicum was the quest for knowledge, the belief that understanding and recovering technology was humanity's highest purpose. This doctrine arose naturally from the Martian circumstances. Surrounded by the ruins of advanced civilization and constantly reminded of how much had been lost, they dedicated themselves to reclaiming what they could from the ashes. The quest manifested in several distinct but complementary approaches. The explorator cohorts ventured into the most dangerous regions of Mars, braving still active defense systems and rogue machines to recover intact technology from abandoned facilities. These expeditions suffered high casualty rates but brought back precious STC fragments, functional machinery, and data storage devices that expanded the Mechanicum's technological base. Meanwhile, the Magi Biologists focused on adapting human physiology to the harsh Martian environment. With medical technology severely limited, they turned to cybernetic augmentation as a solution. The first augmetics were crewed by later standards: mechanical respirators to filter toxic air, basic optical enhancements to see in the dim light of the tunnels, and reinforced limbs to increase physical endurance. Over generations, these modifications became increasingly sophisticated and widespread. This embrace of cybernetic enhancement evolved from necessity into philosophy. If machines represented the pinnacle of efficiency and precision, then integrating machine components into the human form represented an improvement of the flesh. This belief developed into the doctrine of the Omnissiah, the machine god whose perfection could be approached through technological augmentation and understanding. The religious aspects of the cult Mechanicus intensified as technical knowledge became increasingly ritualized. As the actual scientific principles behind advanced technology were forgotten, the procedures for operating and maintaining complex machinery transformed into ceremonial rites. Tech priests passed down precise sequences of actions, which switches to flip, which incantations to recite, which unguents to apply, without understanding the underlying principles. These rituals were effective because they inadvertently preserved correct maintenance procedures, even as the reasons for them were lost. By the 27th millennium, Martian society had developed a stratified hierarchy based on technical knowledge and cybernetic enhancement. At the top were the Archmagos, individuals who had replaced the majority of their organic components with mechanical alternatives and possessed the most comprehensive understanding of ancient technology. Below them were ranked the various orders of tech priests, each specializing in different technological domains. The Logis, who focused on computation and data analysis, the artisans who maintained manufacturing capabilities, and the janitors who studied and modified biological systems. The common population of Mars consisted of menials and servitors, the former being unaugmented humans who performed basic labor, the latter being cybernetically modified humans with limited cognitive function designed for specific tasks. This class structure remained remarkably stable for millennia, providing the organizational framework necessary to gradually reclaim Mars from the devastation of the Age of Strife. As the Mechanicum re-established control over portions of the Martian surface, they began reconstructing the planet's manufacturing capabilities. The first new forges were modest compared to the vast complexes of the Dark Age of technology, but they represented a crucial step forward. These facilities produced the tools and components needed for further expansion, creating a positive feedback loop of technological recovery. The most significant breakthrough came with the rediscovery of a nearly intact STC database in the Arcadia Planitia region. This repository contained designs for a wide range of industrial equipment, power generation systems, and basic weaponry. Though representing only a fraction of humanity's former technological capabilities, these templates allowed the Mechanicum to standardize their manufacturing processes and dramatically increase production efficiency. With this expanded industrial base, the Mechanicum began the ambitious project of constructing new atmospheric domes to replace those destroyed during the rebellion. The first of these, erected over the Olympus Mons caldera around the 28th millennium, became the headquarters of the cult Mechanicus and the site of the first temple of the Omnissiah. This massive structure, built using recovered architectural techniques, could house hundreds of thousands of people in a controlled environment that mimicked pre-Age of Strife conditions. As Mars gradually recovered, the leadership of the Mechanicum formalized their governance structure. The Fabricator General was established as the supreme authority, elected from among the Archmagos by the Parliament of Mars, a deliberative body comprising representatives from each major forge complex. This system provided the stability needed for long-term planning, while allowing for the resolution of disputes between different factions within the cult. These factions had emerged as the Mechanicum expanded, each representing a different interpretation of the quest for knowledge. The Omniscients emphasized the religious aspects of the cult, viewing technology as divine manifestations requiring proper veneration. The innovators advocated for the development of new technologies based on recovered principles, rather than merely preserving ancient designs. The traditionalists insisted on the exact replication of Dark Age technology without modification or experimentation. These philosophical differences occasionally erupted into open conflict. The most devastating of these internal struggles was the schism of the Omniscient Purity, which began when Archmagos Vertical challenged the growing religious orthodoxy. Vertical argued that the ritualization of technology hindered true understanding, and that the Mechanicum should return to the empirical methods of their ancestors. His followers, known as the Verticalists, seized control of several forge complexes in the Northern Hemisphere and began implementing educational reforms that emphasized scientific principles over rote memorization. The Orthodox majority, led by Fabricator General Kelber Howe, declared the Verticalists heretics and launched a military campaign to reclaim the rebel territories. The conflict lasted for nearly a century, with both sides deploying increasingly destructive weapons salvaged from ancient armories. Entire regions of Mars were rendered uninhabitable by radiation or toxic chemical weapons. The war finally ended when Vertical himself was captured during the Battle of Arger Basin and publicly executed by having his mechanical components systematically removed, while his organic remains were kept alive to witness his dismantlement. The aftermath of the schism saw a strengthening of religious orthodoxy within the Mechanicum. The Fabricator General established the Lexorcists, specialized tech priests tasked with identifying and eliminating innovation that strayed too far from approved doctrines. The binary cant language, originally developed as an efficient means of technical communication, was formalized into liturgical patterns that reinforced orthodox interpretations of the quest for knowledge. Despite these internal conflicts, the Mechanicum continued to expand its control over Mars. By the 30th millennium, approximately 30% of the planet's surface had been reclaimed, with dozens of forge complexes operating at near pre-Age of Strife capacity. The largest of these, Olympus Mons, could produce thousands of vehicles, millions of weapons, and countless smaller technological devices annually. This industrial output allowed the Mechanicum to maintain a substantial military force, equipped with advanced weaponry far beyond anything available on Terra at the time. The Titan legions represented the pinnacle of Martian military might. These massive bipedal war machines, standing up to 55 meters tall, combined ancient weapons technology with the Mechanicum's reverence for machines. Each Titan was treated as a sacred entity with its own personality and preferences, maintained by dedicated crews who served as both operators and priests. The first reconstructed Titan, Mechanicum Invictus, was completed around the 29th millennium and became the template for subsequent designs. As the Age of Strife began to wane and warp storms gradually subsided, the Mechanicum detected signs of technological recovery on Terra. Their long-range augers observed energy signatures consistent with advanced power generation systems and limited void ship construction. This discovery prompted intense debate within the Parliament of Mars regarding how to approach their ancestral homeworld. Some advocated for immediate military action to subjugate Terra and incorporate it into the Mechanicum's domains. Others proposed diplomatic outreach to establish mutually beneficial relations. The decisive moment came when Terran void ships entered Martian orbit for the first time in millennia. These vessels, crude by Mechanicum standards, but impressive given Terra's technological regression, carried representatives of the newly ascendant emperor. The Terran emissaries requested a diplomatic meeting at the summit of Olympus Mons, offering an alliance that would unite humanity's birthplace with its technological heartland. The Treaty of Olympus Mons, signed in the early 30th millennium, established the formal relationship between the Mechanicum and what would become the Imperium of Man. The terms acknowledged the Mechanicum's autonomy in internal affairs, including the right to maintain their religious practices and administrative structures. In exchange, Mars would provide technological support for the Emperor's campaign to reunite humanity across the galaxy. While Terra descended into techno-barbarism and Mars forged its new mechanized theology, the outer colonies of mankind faced their own unique challenges during the Age of Strife. These frontier worlds, once proud outposts of human achievement, were left utterly isolated as warp storms severed their connections to Terra and to each other. The resulting isolation forced these colonies to adapt or perish, leading to remarkable divergences in human development across thousands of worlds. On Calth in the Ultramar region, the collapse was particularly dramatic. Once a thriving industrial center with advanced manufacturing capabilities, Calth's surface settlements had relied heavily on regular supply shipments from agricultural worlds. When these shipments ceased, the planet's population faced immediate food shortages. Within a generation, the gleaming cities that had housed millions stood empty as survivors retreated into the vast underground cavern networks that honeycombed the planet. The Calthian adaptation was pragmatic but severe. The underground refugees established hydroponic farming systems using artificial lighting powered by geothermal energy. These operations were sufficient to prevent starvation, but required strict population controls. The Calthian councils implemented a breeding lottery system where only selected citizens were permitted to reproduce, with unauthorized pregnancies terminated by mandatory abortion. This harsh policy ensured survival but transformed Calthian society into a rigidly controlled meritocracy where every aspect of life was regulated for maximum efficiency. The technological regression on Calth was selective rather than total. The colonists maintained their most critical systems, environmental controls, hydroponic farms, and basic medical facilities, while abandoning luxury technologies and most forms of advanced manufacturing. By the time Robout Guilliman rediscovered the world during the Great Crusade, Calthians had developed a pragmatic, communal society with technology roughly equivalent to 20th century Terra, but with significantly more advanced environmental engineering. Fenris presented a stark contrast to Calth's organized regression. The planet had never been fully terraformed, serving instead as a research outpost where scientists studied its extreme climate cycles and unique ecosystem. When contact with Terra ceased, the small scientific contingent found themselves stranded on a death world with minimal survival equipment and no hope of rescue. The first generation of isolated Fenrisians died in massive numbers, with only the most adaptable surviving the planet's harsh winters and predatory fauna. Those who endured did so by adopting a tribal structure centered around extended family units, pooling their limited resources and knowledge. The few pieces of advanced technology, primarily environmental suits and weapons, were treated as sacred relics, their function maintained long after their underlying principles were forgotten. Within 5 generations, Fenrisian society had regressed to a pre-industrial state reminiscent of ancient Norse cultures from Terra's past. This wasn't mere coincidence. The original scientific outpost had included several researchers of Scandinavian descent who had brought cultural practices and mythology with them. These cultural elements provided a framework for understanding their new harsh reality, with the planet's natural phenomena explained through the lens of ancient myths. The most remarkable aspect of Fenrisian adaptation was physiological. The extreme environmental pressures and high radiation levels triggered accelerated evolution among the human population. Fenrisians developed increased muscle mass, enhanced cold tolerance, and improved night vision, adaptations that helped them survive the planet's 6-month winter darkness. These changes were subtle at first, but became more pronounced with each passing generation, creating a distinct human subspecies, by the time the Emperor's forces rediscovered the world. Baal and its moons underwent perhaps the most tragic transformation during the Age of Strife. Once verdant garden worlds created through terraforming marvels, the Baal system had been home to an advanced society that prided itself on artistic and cultural achievements. Archaeological evidence suggests the pre-Strife Baalites maintained vast libraries and museums celebrating human creativity. The collapse came not from the isolation itself, but from the subsequent civil war that erupted over dwindling resources. As food and water became scarce, the population fragmented into competing factions. In their desperation, several groups deployed atomic weapons against their rivals, transforming the once paradise worlds into radioactive deserts within weeks. The survivors of this devastation were forced to adapt to an environment their ancestors had rendered nearly uninhabitable. On Baal Secundus, humans retreated to underground bunkers designed as temporary shelters, stretching their life support systems far beyond intended operational parameters. As these systems gradually failed, the Baalites were forced to venture into the irradiated wasteland, developing primitive radiation shielding techniques using salvaged materials. Generations of exposure to radiation resulted in widespread mutation among the Baalite population. Most mutations were harmful, producing grotesque deformities that resulted in early death. However, some individuals developed beneficial adaptations, enhanced radiation resistance, improved water retention, and more efficient oxygen processing. These individuals, known as the pure among their own kind, formed the ruling class of Baalite society, while those with visible mutations were cast out to form nomadic tribes in the deep deserts. By the time Sanguinius united the scattered tribes of Baal Secundus, the planet's human population had diverged significantly from the baseline. The most successful adaptations included a reinforced digestive system capable of processing foods that would poison unmodified humans, specialized kidney structures that maximized water conservation, and skin that could darken or lighten rapidly to adjust to radiation levels. These adaptations came at a cost, however, as Baalite lifespans shortened considerably, with few individuals surviving beyond 40 Terran years. Not all frontier worlds suffered regression during the Age of Strife. Some colonies, particularly those that possessed intact standard template construct systems, maintained or even advanced their technological capabilities during isolation. Vos Prime stands as the most notable example of this phenomenon, having preserved nearly complete STC archives in deep vaults beneath its primary settlement. The Vos colonists had been primarily engineers and technologists even before the Age of Strife, giving them the knowledge base necessary to maintain complex systems without external support. When isolation came, they implemented a knowledge preservation protocol that required every citizen to memorize specific technical information and pass it to at least 3 apprentices. This redundant system ensured that critical knowledge survived even as written records degraded over time. Vos society evolved into a technocratic oligarchy where status derived from technical expertise rather than wealth or military power. The fabricator caste, responsible for maintaining and operating the remaining STC systems, formed the ruling elite. Below them were the implementors who constructed the designs produced by the STCs, followed by the gatherers who secured resources, and finally the unassigned who performed necessary but unskilled labor. When Imperial explorators rediscovered Vos during the Great Crusade, they found a world technologically comparable to Mars itself, though with a much narrower focus. Vos production centered almost exclusively on void ship components and plasma technology, areas where their preserved STC fragments were most complete. The integration of Vos into the Imperium proceeded smoothly, with the planet becoming a major forge world that maintained significant independence even while acknowledging the authority of Mars. The development of human strains accelerated dramatically during the Age of Strife, as isolated human populations adapted to extreme environments without the moderating influence of gene therapy or controlled adaptation programs. The squat subspecies emerged on high-gravity mining worlds in the galactic core, where generations of adaptation produced stocky, powerful humans with enhanced musculature and reinforced skeletal structures. Their physical changes were accompanied by cultural adaptations, emphasizing clan loyalty and ancestral veneration, traits that helped maintain social cohesion in their harsh underground habitats. On the jungle death world of Cataclysmic, human colonists evolved into a subspecies characterized by exceptional strength and reflexes. The planet's hostile ecosystem, filled with predatory plants and venomous creatures, imposed extreme selection pressure on the human population. Only individuals with quick reactions, physical power, and natural resistance to toxins survived to reproduce. Within 30 generations, Catachans had developed into a distinct strain of humanity, with muscle density 50% greater than baseline humans, enhanced adrenal responses, and natural immunity to most known poisons. More extreme environmental pressures produced even more divergent human subspecies. The void-dwelling navies evolved in the generation ships and space habitats that were stranded in deep space when warp travel became impossible. Their bodies adapted to low-gravity environments with elongated limbs, reduced bone density, and enhanced spatial awareness. Some Navi populations developed limited radiation resistance, allowing them to perform void maintenance tasks that would kill unmodified humans. Not all human adaptation during this period was natural. On worlds that retained advanced biotechnology, deliberate modification continued even as other technologies were lost. The Afriel strain originated on a research outpost where geneticists attempted to create improved humans who could better survive the challenges of the Age of Strife. These modifications focused on enhanced intelligence and psychic sensitivity, traits the creators believed would provide advantages in the new isolation. The experiment produced humans with remarkable cognitive abilities, but also introduced severe autoimmune disorders and psychological instability, flaws that would plague the strain for millennia. Political structures on isolated human worlds diversified as dramatically as the physical forms of their inhabitants. Feudal kingdoms emerged on hundreds of worlds where technology regressed to pre-industrial levels. These systems typically centered around control of critical resources or defensible territory, with hereditary rulers maintaining power through armed retainers. On feudal worlds like Maccabeus Quintus, complex codes of chivalry and honor developed to regulate conflict between competing noble houses, preventing the total warfare that might have destroyed their fragile societies. Theocratic governments became common, particularly on worlds where psychic phenomena manifested during the Age of Strife. On piety, the emergence of warp storms was interpreted as divine judgment, leading to the establishment of the ecclesiarchy of the emperor's light centuries before the actual formation of the imperial cult. This theocracy maintained power through a combination of genuine faith and practical governance, organizing society around ritualized worship while also managing resource distribution and basic infrastructure. Techno-feudal societies represented an interesting hybrid, preserving advanced technology within a feudal political framework. On Krieg, noble houses controlled ancient manufacturing facilities that produced advanced weaponry and environmental systems. These technological resources were treated as hereditary treasures, passed down through aristocratic lineages along with the knowledge required to maintain them. Technical expertise became associated with nobility, creating a class system where mechanical aptitude determined social status. The most successful isolated colonies were those that balanced technological preservation with social adaptation. Macragge exemplified this approach, maintaining significant technological capabilities while developing new social structures suited to their isolation. The Macraggian consuls established a meritocratic system where leadership positions were earned through demonstrated ability rather than inheritance or wealth. This system allowed the most capable individuals to rise to positions of authority regardless of their origins, ensuring that the colony's limited resources were managed efficiently. The Macraggian approach extended to knowledge preservation as well. Rather than focusing exclusively on technological information, their archives maintained historical, philosophical, and cultural records alongside practical knowledge. This holistic preservation effort meant that when Macragge was eventually rediscovered, Its inhabitants understood not just how to operate their remaining technology, but why it had been developed, and how it fit into the broader context of human achievement. As the Age of Strife stretched from centuries into millennia, these isolated human worlds developed increasingly divergent cultures and technologies. Some maintained communication with nearby systems through primitive voidcraft limited to sublight travel. These regional clusters formed micro-federations like the Ultramar Coalition or the Gehenna Compact, sharing resources and knowledge to mutual benefit. Others remained completely isolated, developing in parallel with no awareness of human societies beyond their own planetary system. As human civilization fractured and regressed across the galaxy, the void left by mankind's retreat did not remain empty for long. Alien species that had been held at bay by humanity's technological might during the dark age of technology now found opportunities to expand, conquer, and prey upon the weakened human worlds. The Age of Strife marked not just the collapse of human dominance, but the resurgence of Xeno's powers that would shape the galaxy for millennia to come. The Orcs, ever opportunistic and innately attuned to warfare, were among the first to exploit humanity's vulnerability. Even during the dark age of technology, Orc expansion had been a constant threat, requiring significant military resources to contain. The Greenskin menace possessed a unique advantage during the Age of Strife. Their psychic gestalt field, known as the WAAGH, allowed them to function in warp-disrupted regions where human ships could not travel. While human worlds became isolated from one another, Orc fleets continued to move between star systems, albeit more slowly and with greater difficulty than before. In the Garan Nebula, a region once heavily colonized by humanity, the Orc warlord known as Erlak-Erg united dozens of previously competing tribes into a massive WAAGH force. His crude but effective void ships, powered by a combination of ramshackle technology and the collective psychic belief of his followers, laid waste to human colonies that had once relied on Imperial Navy protection. World after world fell to the green tide, with planetary defense systems failing or being turned against their creators by the surprisingly cunning Orc mechbas who had developed specialized skills in subverting human technology. The mining colony of Akatran III, once a major producer of strategic minerals, was among the first to fall to Erlak's forces. The human defenders, already weakened by resource shortages and civil unrest, were overwhelmed within days of the Orc landing. The Greenskins repurposed the massive excavation machines into mobile battle fortresses, using them to bore directly into the sealed habitat domes that housed the remaining human population. Those not killed in the initial assault were enslaved, forced to continue mining operations under Orc overseers until they died from exhaustion or mistreatment. On Valhalla, the Orc invasion took a different form. Rather than a swift assault, the Greenskins established forward bases on the planet's ice caps, gradually expanding their territory while raiding human settlements for supplies and entertainment. This slow-burn conquest lasted for generations, with the human population adapting to constant warfare. The Valhallans developed a highly militarized society where every citizen received combat training from childhood, and settlements were designed with defense as the primary consideration. When the Emperor's forces finally reached Valhalla during the Great Crusade, they found a population that had been fighting Orcs continuously for over 3 centuries. The expansion of Orc territory during this period was not simply a matter of conquest, but of literal growth. Orc spores, released whenever Greenskins fought and died, took root on thousands of worlds, establishing new populations even after the original invaders moved on. Many human colonies found themselves fighting not just against external Orc attacks, but against recurring infestations that emerged from wilderness areas. The agricultural world of Rin began a practice of regularly burning its vast grasslands to prevent Orc spores from maturing, a tradition that continued into the Imperial era as the Cleansing Fires ceremony. While the Orcs represented a brutal and direct threat, the Dark Eldar posed a more insidious danger to isolated human worlds. The sadistic cousins of the craftworld Eldar, dwelling in the twisted city of Komorog within the Webway, found the Age of Strife particularly advantageous for their raiding activities. With human worlds unable to call for assistance and many defense systems non-operational, the Dark Eldar could strike with near impunity, taking slaves and resources before disappearing back into their hidden realm. The agricultural colony of Tarantis suffered particularly under Dark Eldar predation. The raiders initially targeted outlying farmsteads, abducting dozens of colonists while leaving few witnesses. As planetary authorities concentrated the population in more defensible settlements, the Dark Eldar escalated to larger attacks, using sophisticated technology to bypass defense systems and strike directly at population centers. Their advanced anti-gravitic vehicles, invisible to the colony's degraded sensor networks, allowed them to descend without warning, unleash waves of grotesque pain-inducing weapons, and depart with hundreds of captives before an effective response could be mounted. Over generations, the constant threat of Dark Eldar raids transformed Tyrentian society. The colonists constructed elaborate underground shelters where the population could retreat at the first sign of attack. Children were trained from an early age to respond to specific alarm patterns, and every citizen carried a concealed poison capsule to be used as a last resort if capture seemed imminent. The Tyrentians developed a cultural obsession with pain tolerance, believing that those who could withstand suffering were less valuable to the Dark Eldar, and therefore less likely to be taken. This belief led to ritualized scarification and endurance trials that persisted long after the Dark Eldar threat had been suppressed. The psychological impact of Dark Eldar raids extended beyond their immediate victims. On worlds like Kefris and Mordian, the mere possibility of attack created a pervasive atmosphere of paranoia. Planetary governments imposed strict curfews and movement restrictions, while civilian militias conducted regular sweeps for Xenos infiltrators that often resulted in the persecution of human mutants or political dissidents. The Dark Eldar's legacy was not just the countless souls taken to suffer in Komorog, but the fear that transformed hundreds of human societies into authoritarian states justified by external threats. While the Orcs and Dark Eldar actively preyed upon human worlds, other xenospecies underwent their own significant developments during the Age of Strife. The Tiao, still in their Stone Age developmental phase on their homeworld Tiao, experienced an acceleration of their evolution during this period. Xenobiological studies conducted during the Great Crusade suggest that the Tiao brain structure changed significantly between the 25th and 30th millennia, with enhanced frontal lobes and more complex neural pathways developing in a remarkably short evolutionary timeframe. Some Mechanicum xenobiologists later theorized that the warp storms isolating the Tiao world may have created unique radiation patterns that triggered these accelerated mutations. Others pointed to evidence of subtle genetic manipulation, suggesting that some unknown party, possibly the entities later known to the Tiao as the Ethereals, had deliberately enhanced the species during this critical period. Whatever the cause, by the time the Age of Strife ended, the Tiao had progressed from primitive tribal groups to organized agricultural societies with early metallurgical capabilities, setting the stage for their remarkably rapid technological advancement in subsequent millennia. The Necron dynasties, largely dormant in their stasis tombs throughout the galaxy, remained unaffected by the turmoil of the Age of Strife in direct terms. However, the changing galactic conditions had significant implications for their eventual awakening. On several worlds where Necron tombs lay buried, human colonies had established settlements, unwittingly building cities atop the ancient Xeno structures. As these colonies collapsed during the Age of Strife, some tomb complexes that might have been discovered and potentially destroyed by Dark Age technology remained hidden, their automated repair systems continuing to work silently beneath abandoned human ruins. On Mandragora, a frontier mining colony unwittingly activated a Necron monitoring system when their deep core extraction operations breached a sealed chamber. The colony's subsequent destruction was attributed to a geological catastrophe by neighboring systems, but recovered Vox recordings suggest a more sinister reality, descriptions of living metal constructs rising from the depths and green fire that strips flesh from bone. The incident remained isolated, however, as the tomb's occupants returned to stasis after eliminating the immediate threat, their full awakening protocols not yet triggered. The Age of Strife also saw the rise of numerous minor Xenos empires that flourished in regions formerly dominated by humanity. The Rangdan, previously contained within a small cluster of stars by regular human military interventions, expanded rapidly once those operations ceased. Their assimilation-based technology allowed them to absorb and repurpose both conquered species and their technology, creating a grotesque empire where enslaved human populations were biologically and cybernetically modified to serve their new masters. The Rangdan expansion was particularly devastating in the galactic north, where they conquered over 300 former human worlds. Their technological approach focused on biological manipulation rather than conventional weaponry, transforming planetary ecosystems to suit their physiological needs. On conquered worlds, they released engineered microorganisms that gradually altered atmospheric composition, ocean chemistry, and soil biology, making environments increasingly hostile to human life while optimizing them for Rangdan physiology. Human survivors on these worlds were forced to retreat into sealed habitats, becoming entirely dependent on ancient life support systems that degraded over time. The insected Quorl established their swarmhood in the galactic south, expanding from their original homeworld to dominate nearly 60 star systems. Unlike the Rangdan, the Quorl showed little interest in biological assimilation, instead exterminating or enslaving human populations and repurposing human infrastructure for their own needs. Their hive-based social structure proved remarkably effective during the Age of Strife, as the psychic linkage between Quorl allowed for coordination across multiple star systems, even without conventional faster-than-light communication. Quorl technology developed along unique paths, focusing on biotechnology and chemical engineering rather than the mechanical and electronic systems favored by humanity. Their void ships were essentially massive living organisms, grown rather than built, capable of surviving in the vacuum of space and navigating between stars through a combination of solar sails and limited warp-sensing organs. These biological vessels proved more resilient to warp disturbances than human ships, allowing the Quorl to maintain their interstellar empire even during the height of the Age of Strife. The Atrud, a nomadic species that had long existed on the fringes of human-controlled space, found new opportunities during this period of galactic upheaval. Their natural ability to manipulate entropy fields and move through solid matter made them ideal scavengers of abandoned human technology. Atrud migration swarms targeted isolated human colonies, not primarily as conquerors, but as technological parasites, stripping settlements of valuable resources and equipment before moving on to their next target. On Elysia, repeated Atrud infestations forced the human population to develop specialized countermeasures. The Elysians created temporal stasis fields around their most critical infrastructure, preventing the entropy-accelerating effects of Atrud presence. They also developed unique architectural styles with few solid walls, instead using energy fields and gravity plates to define habitable spaces, structures that offered little concealment for the dimension-shifting Atrud. These adaptations allowed Elysia to maintain a relatively high technological level despite being located in a region heavily trafficked by Atrud swarms. Human responses to Xenos' predation varied widely across the galaxy. Some worlds developed sophisticated defense systems specifically tailored to local threats. The colony of Hydrafer, facing repeated attacks from aquatic Xenos that emerged from their planet's vast oceans, created a network of sonic repulsion fields that kept the aliens confined to deeper waters. On Vestroia, human defenders developed specialized weapons, using chemical compounds toxic to the silicon-based Xenos that had claimed the planet's northern hemisphere, eventually reclaiming territories that had been lost for generations. Other human worlds formed alliances of necessity with minor Xeno species, creating mixed societies that would later be deemed heretical by imperial authorities. The Demiurge trading clans established mutually beneficial relationships with human mining colonies in the galactic west, exchanging technological expertise for access to mineral resources. Several frontier worlds in the Halo stars entered into formal defensive pacts with Kroot mercenary kindreds, gaining protection from more hostile Xenos in exchange for hunting rights and trade goods. The most successful human resistance to Xenos' encroachment came from regions where multiple human worlds maintained contact despite the warp storms. The Ultramar region, where limited sublight travel remained possible between neighboring systems, coordinated defensive operations against Orc expansions from the galactic south. Under the leadership of planetary governors who would eventually pledge allegiance to Robout Guilliman, the Ultramar Coalition maintained a unified military force that conducted regular anti-greenskin operations throughout their sphere of influence. The final millennia of the Eldar Empire represented the most extreme manifestation of decadence any sentient species has achieved in recorded galactic history. What had begun as cultural sophistication and artistic exploration gradually transformed into an all-consuming pursuit of sensation that knew no moral boundaries. The ancient Eldar, with their extraordinarily long lifespans and mastery over matter, had conquered all external challenges. With no wars to fight, no resources to struggle for, and no technological frontiers left to cross, they turned inward, seeking new experiences to fill the emptiness of their existence. The core worlds of the Eldar domain became increasingly devoted to pleasure cults that practiced increasingly extreme rituals. In the sprawling city-states of their central worlds, massive pleasure palaces dominated the landscape, their architecture designed to stimulate and overwhelm the senses. Structures of living crystal changed color and form in response to psychic stimuli, while ambient sound generators created harmonies that could induce specific emotional states. These environments were meticulously crafted to maximize sensory input, the work of artisans who had spent centuries perfecting their craft. Eldar society stratified into specialized pleasure sects, each dedicated to exploring specific sensations to their utmost limits. The cult of sublime pain developed intricate rituals of self-mutilation and torture, its adherents believing that only through extreme suffering could one truly appreciate existence. The Brotherhood of Transcendent Vision used complex psychoactive compounds and mental techniques to achieve altered states of consciousness, often remaining in hallucinatory fugues for years at a time. The Consortium of Flesh Shapers employed advanced biomancy to transform their bodies into new forms, capable of experiencing sensations impossible for their original anatomy. These practices grew increasingly extreme as the Eldar sought ever more intense experiences. Simple pleasures no longer satisfied a species that had spent millennia pursuing sensory stimulation. Acts of violence, previously anathema to Eldar culture, became incorporated into their hedonistic rituals. What began as controlled bloodsport evolved into sadistic spectacles where captives, often from other species but increasingly fellow Eldar, were subjected to elaborate torments for the entertainment of crowds. The psychic nature of the Eldar made this cultural degeneration particularly dangerous. Every emotion, every sensation experienced by an Eldar created ripples in the warp. As billions of Eldar engaged in acts of increasingly uninhibited excess, these ripples merged into powerful currents. The collective psychic energy of an entire species dedicated to extreme sensation began to coalesce around a focal point in the Imperium, drawing together similar energies from across time and space. This coalescence did not go unnoticed by the most sensitive psychers among the Eldar. The seers, traditionally responsible for guiding their civilization, recognized the danger forming in the warp. They observed the growing psychic maelstrom and calculated its inevitable conclusion. Their warnings, however, went largely unheeded. The majority of Eldar society had become too addicted to their lifestyle to contemplate change, while those who might have listened had already departed. The exodus began gradually, with small groups of Eldar who rejected the excesses of their culture. These dissidents constructed massive void ships called craftworlds, self-contained, self-sufficient habitats capable of sustaining populations for millennia. Initially, these vessels were trading ships that maintained contact between distant parts of the Eldar domain. As their society deteriorated, far-sighted Eldar repurposed these vessels as arks, filling them with representatives of their species and cultural treasures they deemed worth preserving. The craftworld Ulthwé was among the first to depart, its population consisting primarily of seers and their disciples who had foreseen the coming catastrophe with particular clarity. They established a Spartan lifestyle aboard their vessel, rejecting the hedonism of their homeworlds and focusing instead on psychic discipline and martial preparation for challenges they knew would come. Ulthwé positioned itself near the Eye of Terror, monitoring the growing disturbance in the warp from a dangerous but strategically valuable vantage point. Craftworld Biel-Tan departed with a different philosophy. Its founders were militant traditionalists who believed the Eldar had lost their way by abandoning their role as galactic stewards. They loaded their vessel with military assets and cultural artifacts celebrating the Eldar's former glory, intending to preserve the martial traditions of their species. The Biel-Tani established a highly structured society centered around military service and ancestral reverence, rejecting hedonism not out of asceticism, but from a belief that it weakened their species. Alatok left the Eldar heartlands motivated by a desire for independence rather than specific foreknowledge of catastrophe. Its founders had long chafed under the increasing conformity of Eldar pleasure cults, preferring self-reliance and personal freedom to the groupthink that dominated their homeworlds. The Alatosai established a culture that valued individual achievement and exploration, sending rangers to distant worlds to observe other species and maintain awareness of galactic developments. Same-Han, one of the last major craftworlds to depart before the fall, preserved the ancient traditions of the Eldar Wild Riders. Its population organized into kinbands led by hereditary chieftains, maintaining a tribal structure that predated the decadence of the core worlds. The Same-Han Eldar retained their aggressive spirit and love of speed, translating ancient customs of beast riding into the use of jet bikes and swift attack craft. Not all who recognized the coming danger chose to flee on craftworlds. Some Eldar retreated to hidden colonies in the Webway, the labyrinthine dimension that connected points across real space. The largest of these settlements was Komorog, originally a trading hub at the junction of several major Webway routes. As the fall approached, Komorog's population swelled with refugees seeking shelter from the psychic storm brewing in the warp. Unlike the craftworld Eldar, who responded to the coming catastrophe by embracing asceticism and rigid self-control, the Komorog refugees sought technological solutions. They developed methods to shield themselves from psychic backlash and continue their hedonistic lifestyle without feeding the growing warp entity. These techniques laid the groundwork for what would become the Dark Eldar culture, a society that replaced psychic abilities with advanced technology and sustained itself through the suffering of others rather than risk drawing the attention of the newly born Chaos God. A smaller faction of Eldar retreated to Maiden Worlds, planets seeded with life millennia earlier as potential colony sites. These became the Exodites, who rejected both the decadence of their homeworlds and the technological sophistication of the craftworlds. They adopted a deliberately primitive lifestyle, forming agrarian communities with limited technology. The Exodites believed that reconnection with natural cycles would protect them from the corruption that had infected their species, a philosophy that proved partially correct when the fall finally came. Despite these various evacuations, the vast majority of the Eldar population remained on their homeworlds, either unaware of or indifferent to the coming catastrophe. Their continued excesses fed the growing presence in the warp, accelerating its development towards sentience. In the final decades before the fall, reality began to thin around the core worlds of the Eldar Empire. Warp phenomena manifested with increasing frequency, objects moving without being touched, individuals experiencing shared hallucinations, and in some cases, the laws of physics temporarily suspending. The birth of Slaanesh, when it finally occurred, was violent beyond comprehension. The accumulated psychic energy of billions of Eldar engaging in extreme sensation for millennia coalesced into a new consciousness within the warp. This entity, which the Eldar would later name She Who Thirsts, awakened with an insatiable hunger for the emotions that had created it. Its first act was to consume the souls of almost the entire Eldar species in a single psychic flare that echoed across the galaxy. The physical manifestation of this psychic birth was equally catastrophic. the barrier between real space and the warp ruptured across an area of several thousand light-years, centered on the core worlds of the Eldar Empire. Planets were pulled into the immaterium, their physical substance dissolving into the stuff of raw chaos. Stars collapsed or exploded as their material was drawn into the warp breach. An entire sector of the galaxy, once home to the most advanced civilization in existence, became a swirling mass of warp energy intermingled with fragments of real space. This wound in reality became known as the Eye of Terror, a fitting name for a region where the laws of physics held no sway, and the nightmares of sentient beings took physical form. The Eye would remain a permanent feature of the galaxy, a monument to the fall of the Eldar, and a gateway through which the forces of chaos could enter real space. Its boundaries fluctuated over time, expanding during periods of intense warp activity and contracting when the material universe asserted its natural laws. The psychic shockwave of Slaanesh's birth extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the Eye. Across the galaxy, psychers of all species experienced the event as a moment of excruciating pain, followed by visions of unspeakable beauty and horror intertwined. Many died instantly, their minds unable to process the contradictory sensations. Others were driven permanently insane, babbling about the beautiful end and pleasure beyond flesh before taking their own lives in attempts to rejoin the sensation. Human psychers, already struggling with the challenges of their emerging abilities, were particularly vulnerable to this psychic shockwave. On thousands of worlds, untrained psychers became gateways for lesser warp entities drawn in Slaanesh's wake. These possessions manifested in various forms, some victims transformed into physical embodiments of excess, compelled to seek sensation at any cost, while others became conduits for empathic energy, broadcasting waves of emotion that drove entire communities to hedonistic frenzy or suicidal despair. The most dramatic effects occurred on worlds near the Eye of Terror. The human population of Cadia, located at the stable entrance to the Eye, experienced mass possession, as Slaanesh's birth weakened the barrier between real space and the warp. Only the activation of ancient pylons, structures of unknown origin embedded in the planet's crust, prevented complete daemonic incursion. These pylons, later studied by the Mechanicum, appeared designed specifically to reinforce reality against warp intrusion, suggesting that some unknown faction had anticipated the need for such defenses. For the surviving Eldar, Slaanesh's birth created an existential crisis unlike anything faced by any other species. The god they had unknowingly created had a fundamental connection to their souls, drawing them inexorably toward it upon death. Every Eldar who died found their soul pulled into Slaanesh's grasp, subjected to eternal torment by the deity their ancestors had created. This thirst for Eldar souls became the defining feature of their post-fall existence, necessitating new approaches to their society and spirituality. The Craftworld Eldar developed the most comprehensive response to this threat. Their seers created spirit stones, psychically attuned crystals that could capture and preserve an Eldar's soul at the moment of death, preventing it from being drawn into the warp. These stones were later incorporated into each Craftworld's Infinity Circuit, a psychic network that housed the collective souls of dead Eldar. Within this circuit, the dead maintained a form of consciousness, contributing their knowledge and experience to their descendants while being shielded from Slaanesh's grasp. The creation of the Infinity Circuits led to the development of the Path System, a philosophical approach that defined post-fall Craftworld society. Recognizing that the lack of restraint had doomed their ancestors, the Eldar established rigid guidelines for personal development. Each individual would focus completely on a single discipline, be it warfare, artistry, or scholarship, mastering it before moving to another. This compartmentalization prevented the emotional excess that had fed Slaanesh, while still allowing for the development of extraordinary skills over their long lifespans. The Navigator houses represented one of humanity's most remarkable adaptations to the challenges of warp travel. These genetically modified humans, distinguished by their third eye that could perceive the currents of the Imperium, had guided mankind's vessels through the warp since the early days of interstellar expansion. During the Dark Age of technology, Navigator families had achieved unprecedented status, their services essential to the vast trade networks that connected human worlds. When the Age of Strife descended upon the galaxy, the navigator houses faced an existential crisis. The violent warp storms that isolated human worlds made traditional navigation nearly impossible. Even the most skilled navigators found themselves unable to plot safe courses through the roiling Imperium. Ships that attempted warp jumps frequently emerged centuries off course, thousands of light years from their intended destinations, or failed to return altogether. House Belisarius, once among the most prestigious navigator lineages, with a monopoly on routes through the Segmentum Pacificus, lost over 70% of their active navigators in the first century of the Age of Strife. Their flagship, the Golden Perception, disappeared while attempting to chart a new route through the increasingly turbulent warp, taking with it 3 generations of the family's leadership and their accumulated navigational charts. This catastrophic loss forced the remaining Belisarius navigators to retreat to their fortified compound on Terra, abandoning their off-world holdings to focus solely on survival. The isolation imposed by warp storms created a new challenge for navigator houses: maintaining genetic purity. The navigator gene had always required careful management through selective breeding programs. During the dark age of technology, navigator houses had maintained diverse genetic stock by exchanging marriage partners between families scattered across human space. With interstellar travel severely limited, these houses were forced to rely on increasingly restricted breeding pools. House Nostromo addressed this challenge by establishing an extensive genetic repository on their ancestral estate in the Himalaysian region of Terra. This facility contained thousands of frozen embryos and genetic samples collected over centuries, allowing them to maintain genetic diversity despite physical isolation. Their genetors developed sophisticated screening techniques to identify and eliminate harmful mutations while preserving the essential navigator characteristics. This approach proved largely successful, though it required significant technological resources that many lesser houses lacked. Other navigator families attempted more desperate solutions. House Zan, trapped on the isolated world of Eustes Majoris, experimented with controlled mutation, deliberately exposing developing fetuses to specific warp energies to strengthen the navigator gene. The results were unpredictable. Some offspring developed enhanced navigational abilities but suffered severe physical deformities, while others appeared normal but possessed unstable psychic profiles that made them dangerous to their own kind. Within 4 generations, the Zan bloodline had diverged significantly from standard navigator physiology, developing distinctive scale-like skin and elongated limbs that would mark them as outsiders even after their eventual reintegration with other navigator houses. The most controversial approach came from House Moroda, whose leadership authorized breeding programs with non-navigator humans possessing latent psychic abilities. This decision, considered heretical by navigator traditionalists, was born of desperation after a series of stillbirths threatened the house's survival. The resulting offspring showed weakened navigator characteristics, but greater resistance to warp exposure. When interstellar travel became possible again after the Age of Strife, the Moroda navigators found themselves ostracized by other houses, forced to serve on less prestigious vessels and routes despite their unique abilities. For those navigator houses that maintained their traditional genetic lines, the Age of Strife became a period of intense political maneuvering on Terra itself. Unable to exercise their primary function as warp guides, they leveraged their accumulated wealth and influence to secure positions within the fragmented power structures of humanity's homeworld. House Belisarius formed a strategic alliance with the Pan-Pacific Empire, providing financial backing and limited precognitive services in exchange for military protection. House Nostromo established itself as a neutral party in the conflicts between Techno-Barbarian states, operating as intermediaries and information brokers. These political entanglements had lasting consequences for navigator society. Houses that had previously defined themselves solely through their warp navigation capabilities developed secondary specializations that would persist into the imperial era. House Belisarius became known for financial acumen and economic forecasting, while House Nostromo developed expertise in information gathering and analysis. These expanded capabilities later proved valuable when the Navigator houses negotiated their position within the nascent Imperium. The Navigator house's struggle for survival paled in comparison to the challenges faced by humanity's astropaths during the Age of Strife. These specialized psychers, trained to transmit thoughts across interstellar distances through the warp, found their abilities severely compromised by the same warp turbulence that disrupted navigation. The carefully established astropathic relay network that had connected human worlds during the dark age of technology collapsed almost completely within decades. On Terra, the central astropathic nexus, once capable of maintaining simultaneous contact with thousands of worlds, found itself unable to reach beyond the Sol system. The increasingly desperate attempts to penetrate the warp storms resulted in tragedy when a group of 50 senior astropaths attempted a coordinated sending in 876 M23. The psychic backlash killed 37 outright, while the survivors suffered severe mental damage, experiencing recurring visions of screaming darkness that rendered them unable to perform their duties. The few successful astropathic transmissions during this period were limited in both range and clarity. Messages that would previously have been sent instantaneously across hundreds of light years now required multiple relay points, with each transition increasing the risk of corruption or loss. A simple communication from Terra to Alpha Centauri, once a routine matter, might take weeks to arrive and often reached its destination as fragmentary impressions rather than coherent thoughts. Astropaths adapted to these limitations by developing new transmission protocols. Rather than attempting to send detailed information, they focused on simple emotional impressions and symbolic imagery that could penetrate the warp disturbances more effectively. These techniques sacrificed precision for reliability, allowing at least some form of communication to continue between worlds in close proximity. The symbolic language developed during this period would later form the foundation for the standardized astropathic codes used throughout the Imperium. On isolated human worlds, the status of psychers, including astropaths, varied dramatically based on local conditions and cultural responses to psychic phenomena. Some societies elevated psychers to positions of religious or political authority, while others persecuted them as witches or mutants. This divergence created vastly different experiences for psyker populations across human space. On Prospero, a colony world with an unusually high percentage of psychically gifted individuals, the isolation of the Age of Strife led to the development of a sophisticated psychic culture. The Prosperine Covenant established formal training methods for different psychic disciplines, with astropaths forming a prestigious order focused on maintaining contact with other settlements across their planet. When attempts to reach beyond Prospero failed, these astropaths redirected their talents toward internal communication, creating a planetary network that allowed their civilization to maintain cohesion despite physical barriers. The Prosperine approach stood in stark contrast to worlds like Fenris, where emerging psychers were viewed with superstitious fear. Those displaying astropathic abilities were either killed outright or exiled to isolated locations where they served as tribal oracles, their communications with the warp interpreted as messages from ancestral spirits or gods. These untrained astropaths rarely survived more than a few years, their minds eventually overwhelmed by unfiltered warp exposure. Perhaps the most extreme example of psyker authority emerged on the world of Gathalamer, where a group of astropaths established complete control over the planet's population. Led by a powerful telepath known as the Vox Dominatus, these psychers claimed to receive messages from the Master of Mankind, a distant ruler who demanded absolute obedience. Whether this was a deliberate deception or a misinterpretation of fragmented astropathic signals remains unclear, but the resulting theocracy maintained power for nearly 15 centuries, controlling every aspect of Gathalamer society through a combination of psychic domination and conventional force. The technological regression that characterized the Age of Strife forced many human worlds to experiment with alternative methods of warp travel. Without reliable navigator guidance or functional gellar fields to protect vessels from warp predators, standard warp jumps became suicidal. Yet the need for interstellar travel, even limited to neighboring systems, drove desperate innovation. The Hephaestus cartel, operating from mining colonies in the Helios cluster, developed skimming techniques that involved brief, calculated dips into the shallowest layers of the warp. These micro-jumps covered only a fraction of the distance achieved by true warp travel, but allowed vessels to move between adjacent star systems without extended warp exposure. The technique required precise calculations and timing, with ships remaining in the warp for no more than a few minutes before returning to real space. Even with these precautions, the cartel lost approximately 1 ship in 5, considered an acceptable risk given the alternative of complete isolation. A more radical approach emerged in the Ghoul Stars region, where the Nomad fleet attempted to bypass the warp entirely. Their technologists repurposed ancient null field generators to create localized bubbles where real space laws were distorted, allowing for faster-than-light travel without warp immersion. The system proved functionally limited, achieving speeds only 3 to 4 times faster than light, but offered greater safety in regions where warp storms were most intense. The tremendous energy requirements restricted this technology to the largest vessels, and the psychological effects of null field exposure limited journey durations. Both these alternatives represented significant compromises compared to proper navigator-guided warp travel. The limited range and slow speed meant that human worlds remained effectively isolated for all practical purposes, with only the most determined or desperate individuals attempting interstellar journeys. Trade between systems collapsed to a fraction of pre-strife levels, while military or humanitarian interventions became virtually impossible. The catastrophic failures far outnumbered the limited successes. The Terran hegemony's attempt to maintain contact with its closest colonies resulted in the loss of the entire 9th Expeditionary Fleet when their experimental warp anchor system failed catastrophically. Designed to tether vessels to fixed points in real space while traversing the warp, the anchors initially appeared promising in controlled tests. When deployed in actual warp conditions, however, the anchors created unpredictable resonance patterns that attracted predatory warp entities. Astropathic observers reported receiving death screams from thousands of minds simultaneously as the fleet was destroyed. Even more disturbing was the fate of the Omicron expedition, which attempted to use human psychers as navigational conduits without proper training or protection. The expedition's leadership, desperate to reach resource-rich systems beyond their immediate stellar neighborhood, forced groups of psychers to form mental links with the ship's guidance systems. The initial results seemed promising, with successful jumps to 2 neighboring systems. On the 3rd jump, however, something went catastrophically wrong. The vessel emerged from the warp decades later, its hull intact, but its interior spaces transformed into nightmarish organic structures. The few survivors recovered by Imperial explorators during the Great Crusade had been physically fused with the ship's components, their minds locked in endless loops of the same moment, the transition into the warp when their protection had failed. These failures reinforced the essential role of properly trained navigators and the critical importance of functional gellar fields for warp travel. The alternative methods developed during the Age of Strife were largely abandoned once traditional warp travel became possible again, preserved only in fragmentary technical documents or as cautionary tales. Some techniques were later refined and incorporated into specialized Imperial technologies, but most were classified as dangerous tech heresy by the Mechanicum. The isolation of human worlds during this period created a paradoxical situation for navigators and astropaths. Their primary functions, guiding ships through the warp and communicating across interstellar distances, were severely compromised, yet their secondary abilities became increasingly valuable. Navigator precognition, limited but real, provided strategic advantages in the conflicts that engulfed Terra and other worlds. Astropathic sensitivity to warp disturbances allowed for early warning of demonic incursions or dangerous warp phenomena. The first glimmers of humanity's resurgence began not with grand proclamations, but with calculated violence in the Himalayan mountains. There, amid the radiation-scarred peaks that had once housed the planet's most exclusive retreats, a warlord unlike any other emerged from obscurity. Historical records from this period remain fragmentary, with many deliberately purged in later centuries, but surviving accounts describe a figure of immense physical presence who commanded not through fear alone, but through a clarity of purpose that drew the desperate and the visionary alike. The Emperor's early conquests targeted the Techno-Barbarian strongholds, controlling Terra's few remaining functional technological repositories. The assault on the Terawatt clan's primary generator complex established the pattern that would define his unification campaigns. Rather than simply destroying his opponents, the Emperor's forces executed precision strikes that preserved critical infrastructure while eliminating leadership. Within the Terawatt fortress, his warriors, at this point still unaugmented humans equipped with salvaged weaponry, disabled the outer defenses using electromagnetic pulse weapons before infiltrating through maintenance tunnels that conventional maps had long forgotten. When the clan's techno-lord awoke to find the Emperor seated on his command throne, surrounded by the decapitated heads of his personal guard, he faced a simple choice: serve or die. The pattern would repeat dozens of times across Terra's fractured landscape. The Undonesic bloc, whose despotic rulers had perfected the art of population control through chemical pacification, discovered their atmospheric distribution systems, releasing loyalty-enhancing compounds keyed to the Emperor's genetic signature rather than their own. The Pan-Pacific Empire's communication network, supposedly secure behind quantum encryption, broadcast the Emperor's terms of surrender on all frequencies simultaneously. These early victories provided the Emperor with the resources needed to begin his most ambitious project: the creation of genetically enhanced warriors' purpose built for the campaigns ahead. The Thunder Warriors represented the first iteration of this vision: massive, brutally effective soldiers whose enhanced physiology made them living weapons. Standing nearly 3 meters tall with musculature twice as dense as unmodified humans, these warriors could tear through conventional defenses with terrifying efficiency. The first Thunder Warrior cohorts were deployed against the Nordic consolidation, whose territory included several intact pre-Age of Strife armories. Conventional military analysis had rated the Nordic defenses as impenetrable, with automated sentry guns and energy shields protecting approaches through the frozen wastelands. The Thunder Warriors rendered such calculations obsolete. Moving at speeds impossible for normal humans despite their bulk, they crossed the killing zones before automated targeting systems could acquire them, then dismantled defense emplacements with their bare hands. Survivors of these early battles described the Thunder Warriors with a mixture of awe and terror. A Nordic commander's journal, recovered from the ruins of their final stronghold, described them as giants who laugh as they kill, shrugging off wounds that would fell 10 normal men. This resilience came from multiple redundant organs and accelerated healing capabilities that allowed them to continue fighting despite injuries that would be immediately fatal to unmodified humans. Despite their effectiveness, the Thunder Warriors suffered from critical flaws. Their enhanced metabolism burned with such intensity that their bodies began to break down after only a few years of service. Psychological instability plagued many, with berserker rages making them as dangerous to allies as to enemies when battle lust overtook them. Most significantly, they were created as weapons rather than builders, perfect for the destruction of the old order, but unsuited for the construction of the new. The unification wars accelerated as the Emperor's forces grew in number and sophistication. The Battle of Mount Narodnya marked a turning point, with over 5,000 Thunder Warriors facing the combined armies of the Urals Confederation. The Confederation had spent decades preparing this battleground, with layered defenses including buried atomic charges, genetically engineered plague vectors, and psychically attuned warning systems designed to detect approaching forces. None of it mattered. The Thunder Warriors struck at dawn, descending from captured aircraft onto multiple points along the Confederation's defensive line. By midday, they had penetrated to the central command bunker, a facility buried 2 kilometers beneath the mountain. Rather than tunnel down, the Thunder Warriors triggered the Confederation's own atomic charges in a calculated pattern that created a direct shaft to the bunker. They then descended through the radioactive crater, their enhanced physiology shrugging off radiation levels that melted their armor to their skin. With each victory, the Emperor consolidated not just territory, but knowledge. The Adeptus Archive, hidden beneath the ruins of what had once been a pre-Age of Strife university complex, contained technical specifications for void-capable ships that would later form the core of his early fleet. The Pan-Pacific data vaults provided agricultural techniques adapted to Terra's poisoned soil, crucial for feeding the growing population united under his banner. Most valuable were the scattered fragments of information about the wider galaxy. Though the Age of Strife had isolated Terra, certain Techno-Barbarian factions had maintained limited astronomical observation capabilities. The Emperor's scholars meticulously compiled these observations, creating the first accurate map of warp storm activity across the galaxy in millennia. This data proved crucial in planning the early stages of the Great Crusade, identifying regions where the storms were weakening and interstellar travel might soon become possible. As the Unification Wars progressed, the Emperor began to gather individuals with specialized knowledge who would form the core of his future administration. The Navigator houses, which had maintained their genetic lines throughout the Age of Strife, were among the first to pledge allegiance. House Belisarius committed their most gifted navigators to the Emperor's service, recognizing that his conquest of Terra would inevitably extend to the stars once the warp storms abated. The recruitment of the nascent Mechanicum required more delicate negotiation. Initial contact with Mars occurred through limited Vox exchanges, with the Emperor's emissaries presenting carefully selected technological artifacts as evidence of Terra's reawakening. These preliminary discussions laid the groundwork for what would become the Treaty of Mars, though full diplomatic relations remained impossible until reliable interplanetary travel could be reestablished. On Terra itself, the Emperor's authority expanded through a combination of military conquest and political absorption. The Pan-Pacific territories, having witnessed the destruction of their military forces, negotiated integration into the new Terran authority. Their ruling dynasties were permitted to maintain nominal control over their territories in exchange for technological tribute and acceptance of the Emperor's oversight. This pattern of allowing limited autonomy to cooperative regimes while utterly destroying those who resisted maximized the speed of unification while minimizing the resources required. The Achaemenid zones represented one of the most significant challenges to unification. Unlike other techno-barbarian states that relied on salvage technology, the Achaemenids had maintained a relatively advanced scientific tradition throughout the Age of Strife. Their gene-crafted soldiers, while not as physically imposing as Thunder Warriors, possessed specialized adaptations including chameleonic skin that rendered them nearly invisible and enhanced sensory organs that could detect enemies through solid barriers. The Emperor's response demonstrated his tactical flexibility. Rather than a direct assault, he initiated a campaign of targeted infiltration. Selected operatives, their minds psychically shielded against detection, penetrated Achaemenid territory to identify critical vulnerabilities. Over 6 months, these agents mapped supply lines, command structures, and defensive emplacements while remaining undetected. When the attack finally came, it struck simultaneously at 37 distinct locations, decapitating the Achaemenid leadership before they could coordinate a response. As Terra gradually unified under the Emperor's rule, the first Imperial army regiments took shape from the integrated forces of conquered territories. Unlike the Thunder Warriors, who functioned as shock troops and executioners, these regiments were trained for occupation, pacification, and eventually, colonization. The Xeric Auxiliaries, recruited from the desert warriors of the former Pan-Pacific Southern Territories, specialized in operating in toxic environments. The Terawatt Clade contributed technical specialists who could maintain and repair the increasingly sophisticated equipment being recovered or produced in newly established manufactoria. These early regiments lacked the standardization that would characterize the later Imperial Army, instead maintaining distinctive equipment and tactics reflecting their origins. The 9th Terran Rangers continued to use the distinctive long-pattern Las rifles developed during their resistance against the Ursh occupation, weapons that sacrificed rate of fire for penetrating power. The Stratus cohort maintained their tradition of implanting communication devices directly into soldiers' vocal cords, allowing for silent coordination during stealth operations. The standardization process began gradually, with the Emperor's tech adepts analyzing the various weapons and equipment used by each regiment to identify optimal designs. The Terran pattern bolter, which would later evolve into the standard Astartes weapon, emerged from this process as a compromise between the heavy-caliber slug throwers favored by the Thunder Warriors and the more energy-efficient las weapons used by several army regiments. Initial production runs were limited by resource constraints, with only officer cadres and special operations units receiving the new weapons. As the final pockets of resistance on Terra were eliminated, the Emperor turned his attention to the Sol system. Limited expeditions to Luna confirmed what astronomical observations had suggested. The Selenar gene cults had maintained their technological capabilities throughout the Age of Strife, continuing their experiments in human modification within their pressurized domes. Initial diplomatic overtures were met with caution bordering on hostility, as the Selenar leadership recognized the implicit threat in Terra's reunification. Preparations for the Great Crusade accelerated as the Emperor's seers detected a gradual weakening of the warp storms that had isolated Terra. The construction of void-capable ships began in the reclaimed orbital shipyards above Terra, with designs incorporating both recovered standard template construct fragments and innovations developed by the Emperor's engineers. These vessels were modest compared to the massive ships that would later form the Imperial fleet, but represented a crucial first step toward interstellar capability. The most significant development during this period occurred not in public view, but in laboratories deep beneath the Himalayan mountains. There, using knowledge and materials that remain classified even in the 41st millennium, the Emperor began the Primarch Project, an effort to create 20 superhuman generals who would lead his crusade across the stars. The genetic framework for these beings incorporated the Emperor's own DNA, combined with engineered traits that pushed the boundaries of human potential. Simultaneously, the Emperor established the framework for the organizations that would administer his growing domain. The Council of Terra, comprising selected representatives from cooperative Techno-Barbarian states, managed the integration of conquered territories and the standardization of laws across the unified planet. The Officio Assassinorum, though not yet formally named as such, began as a cadre of specialized operatives tasked with eliminating potential resistance leaders before they could organize effective opposition. The Astronomicon, which would later serve as the psychic beacon guiding Imperial ships through the warp, began as a more modest project aimed at stabilizing local warp space around Terra. Utilizing technologies and techniques that combined ancient human science with the Emperor's unique psychic abilities, this proto-Astronomicon created a bubble of relative calm in the Imperium that allowed for more reliable short-range warp travel within the Sol system. As the Thunder Warriors continued to secure the final unconquered regions of Terra, signs of their inherent flaws became increasingly apparent. Incidents of warriors turning on their handlers or engaging in unnecessary brutality against civilian populations increased in frequency. Medical examinations revealed accelerating cellular degradation that no amount of treatment could reverse. The Emperor, recognizing that these first-generation enhanced warriors had served their purpose, began planning for their replacement. The seeds of the Legion's Astartes were sown in secret facilities scattered across unified Terra. Using genetic material derived from the Primarch Project, the Emperor's biologists adepts developed a more stable enhancement process that, while producing warriors less immediately powerful than the Thunder Warriors, created soldiers with far greater longevity and psychological stability. The first test subjects were drawn from the children of conquered territories, selected for specific genetic markers that indicated compatibility with the enhancement process. These proto-Astartes underwent modifications that would establish the template for all Space Marines to follow. The Osmodula organ, which enhanced skeletal strength by promoting the growth of ceramic-based bone material, addressed the structural weaknesses that had plagued the Thunder Warriors. The catalepsian node, allowing Marines to function with minimal sleep, eliminated the periods of post-battle catatonia that had rendered Thunder Warriors' combat ineffective for days after intense engagements. Most importantly, the psychological conditioning protocols were refined to produce warriors who were not just killers but soldiers, capable of restraint, strategic thinking, and loyalty beyond the Thunder Warriors' capacity. As the final battles for Terra's unification concluded, the Emperor's attention increasingly turned skyward. The Treaty of Mars, formalized through in-person negotiations after void ship travel between Terra and the Red Planet became reliable, established the foundation for the Imperium's technological base. The Mechanicum pledged their industrial and technical expertise to the Emperor's cause in exchange for autonomy in their internal affairs and protection for their religious practices. This agreement, signed in the shadow of Olympus Mons, included practical provisions for the immediate exchange of resources and knowledge. Mars provided advanced weaponry, void ship components, and technical experts to accelerate Terra's technological recovery. In return, the Emperor granted the Mechanicum access to certain technological data recovered during the Unification Wars, and more significantly, promised them the opportunity to reclaim lost knowledge from human colonies across the galaxy once the Great Crusade began. With Terra unified, Mars allied, and the first Astartes in training, the Emperor stood at the threshold of his greatest ambition. The warp storms that had isolated humanity for millennia showed increasing signs of abatement. Astropathic communications, though still limited and unreliable, occasionally managed to reach beyond the Sol system, making contact with human worlds that had survived the Age of Strife. These fragile connections confirmed what the Emperor had long suspected: humanity endured among the stars, waiting to be reunited under a single authority that could protect them from the darkness that had nearly consumed them. Deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, in laboratories shielded by technologies dating back to the Dark Age of Technology, the Emperor embarked on his most ambitious undertaking yet. The Primarch Project represented the culmination of millennia of genetic research, combining the Emperor's own genetic material with engineered traits that pushed far beyond normal human limitations. These 20 superhuman beings were designed not merely as warriors, but as generals, statesmen, and inheritors of the Imperium the Emperor envisioned. The facilities housing the Primarch Project were unlike any other on Terra. Multiple layers of physical and psychic shielding protected the laboratories from detection, while automated defense systems eliminated any unauthorized personnel who somehow penetrated the outer barriers. At the heart of this complex lay 20 gestation capsules, each containing a developing Primarch suspended in a nutrient-rich amniotic fluid infused with genetic accelerants and stabilizing compounds. Each Primarch was genetically coded with specific traits that would make them ideal leaders for their future space Marine legions. Some were designed with enhanced tactical acumen, others with diplomatic skills or technological aptitude. All shared certain baseline improvements: phenomenal physical strength, enhanced intelligence, accelerated healing, and extended lifespans. The Emperor personally monitored their development, making minute adjustments to their genetic structure as they grew within their artificial wombs. The genetic science involved in creating the Primarchs went far beyond simple enhancement. The Emperor incorporated complex psychogenetic triggers that would activate specific abilities as each Primarch matured. He embedded knowledge directly into their developing minds, languages, tactical doctrines, and fragments of history that would guide their development even if separated from his direct influence. Most importantly, he wove his own genetic material throughout their being, creating a psychic connection that would allow him to locate them across the vastness of space. The development process took years, with each Primarch growing at an accelerated rate within their gestation capsules. Specialized Medici personnel, sworn to absolute secrecy, monitored their vital signs and reported directly to the Emperor. The few surviving records from this period indicate that the process was not without complications. Several Primarchs exhibited unexpected genetic instabilities that required intervention, while others developed traits that deviated from their initial design parameters. the Emperor adjusted his approach for each, treating the process as both science and artistry. As the Primarchs neared completion, the Emperor began preparations for the next phase of his plan. Using genetic material from each Primarch, his biologist adepts created 20 distinct gene seed templates that would form the basis for the Space Marine Legions. These templates preserved the unique characteristics of each Primarch while making them compatible with standard human physiology. The first test implementations began with carefully selected candidates, children chosen for specific genetic markers that indicated compatibility with the enhancement process. These proto-Astartes would form the officer cadres for the future legions, trained directly under the Emperor's supervision while awaiting the maturation of their respective Primarchs. The process was refined through trial and error, with early failures leading to adjustments in both the gene seed itself and the implantation protocols. By the time the Primarchs were scheduled to emerge from their gestation capsules, the Emperor had successfully created several hundred Space Marines, divided among 20 distinct genetic lineages. Then came the catastrophe that would alter the course of human history. The exact details remain heavily redacted in Imperial records, with contradictory accounts suggesting everything from mechanical failure to deliberate sabotage. What is known with certainty is that a massive warp disturbance breached the laboratory's psychic shielding, creating a localized warp rift within the Primarch facility itself. In an instant, the 20 gestation capsules were swept into the Imperium, scattering the infant Primarchs across the galaxy. The Emperor's reaction to this devastating setback revealed both his pragmatism and his determination. After personally leading efforts to seal the warp breach and secure the facility, he immediately convened his inner circle to assess the situation. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor, reportedly advocated for abandoning the Primarch project entirely and focusing solely on the Space Marine Legions. The Emperor rejected this approach, confident that his genetic connection to the Primarchs would eventually allow him to locate them as the Great Crusade expanded across the galaxy. The loss of the Primarchs necessitated a change in the Emperor's timeline, but not his overall strategy. He accelerated the development of the Space Marine Legions, expanding the recruitment and implantation programs to create thousands of enhanced warriors based on the 20 gene seed templates. Each legion developed distinctive traits reflecting their Primarch's genetic legacy, even without the direct influence of their gene father. The Thunder Warriors, already showing signs of the instability that would ultimately doom them, continued to serve as the Emperor's primary military force, while the Astartes legions grew in number and experience. The warp storms that had isolated Terra for millennia began to abate around this time, allowing for more reliable interstellar travel. The Emperor's seers interpreted this as confirmation that the time for the Great Crusade had arrived, despite the setback with the Primarchs. Preparations accelerated, with the newly formalized Mechanicum of Mars providing increasingly sophisticated weaponry and void ships for the coming expansion. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, 20 genetically perfect infants emerged from their damaged gestation capsules on distant worlds. The Chaos Powers, having engineered the scattering, took a keen interest in these beings. Each Primarch represented a potential asset in their eternal struggle against the Emperor, and they monitored the children's development with malicious anticipation. Some Primarchs they attempted to corrupt directly, while others they influenced through more subtle manipulations of their environments and circumstances. On Cethonia, a mining world of tunnels and perpetual darkness near Terra, a child with golden eyes emerged from a metallic pod deep within an abandoned shaft. The miners who discovered him recognized something extraordinary in the infant despite their harsh existence. This child, who would eventually be named Horus, grew with unnatural speed, reaching adult size and strength within a few years. His natural charisma and tactical brilliance allowed him to unite the warring gangs of Cethonia under his leadership, transforming them from scattered raiders into an organized force. Across the galaxy on Macragge, one of the few worlds to maintain a relatively advanced civilization throughout the Age of Strife, another pod crashed through the atmosphere and landed in a remote forest. The child was discovered by a patrol of Macraggian soldiers and brought to Connor Gilliman, one of the planet's 2 consuls. Connor adopted the child, naming him Robout, and raised him as his own son. Under Connor's tutelage, Robout Guilliman learned the principles of governance and warfare that defined Macragian society, eventually succeeding his adoptive father as consul and unifying the entire planet under his rule. On the radiation-scorched world of Baal Secundus, a third pod landed in the desolate wasteland. The infant inside should have perished in the hostile environment, but instead thrived, protected by his enhanced physiology. Found by one of the nomadic tribes that struggled to survive in the irradiated deserts, the child, later named Sanguinius, manifested wings as he grew, a mutation that would have meant death among the mutation-hating tribes of Baal. Instead, his noble character and extraordinary abilities led the tribe to view him as a savior rather than an abomination. Sanguinius united the scattered tribes of Baal Secundus, teaching them to value strength of character above physical perfection. The death world of Caliban received one of the most martial primarchs. The pod containing the child who would become Lion Eljonson crashed in a forest infested with warp-mutated beasts that terrorized the human settlements. The infant was discovered not by humans, but by these same beasts, who mysteriously left him unharmed. He grew alone in the forest until discovered by a hunting party led by Luther, a Knight of the Order, Caliban's premier martial organization. The nameless child, by then a wild young man, was brought to civilization and named Lion Eljonson, the lion, son of the forest. His natural martial prowess allowed him to rise quickly through the Order's ranks, eventually leading a successful campaign to rid Caliban of the warped beasts that had plagued it for generations. On the frozen world of Fenris, where human colonists had regressed to a tribal culture reminiscent of ancient Terran Norse societies, a pod crashed through the ice during the planet's harsh winter. The infant was discovered by a warrior named Thengir, who brought him to his tribe. Named Lemon Russ after legendary creatures from Fenrisian mythology, the child grew into a fierce warrior who could match the great wolves of Fenris in combat. After being cast out from his tribe for killing a man in a fit of rage, Russ was adopted by a pack of Fenrisian wolves, living among them and learning their ways until he was discovered by the king of the Russ tribe, whom he eventually succeeded. The Forge world of Nocturne became home to Vulcan, whose pod landed near an active volcano. He was found by Enbel, a blacksmith and elder of one of Nocturne's small settlements. Despite the harsh environment and constant seismic activity that periodically destroyed their settlements, Nocturne's people had maintained their humanity through strong community bonds and practical skills. Vulcan grew quickly, surpassing his adoptive father in size and strength by age 3. His natural affinity for metallurgy and engineering allowed him to create weapons and tools of extraordinary quality, which he used to defend his community from the predatory Dark Eldar raiders that plagued Nocturne. The mining world of Medusa received Ferrus Manus, whose pod crashed into a landscape of barren rock and toxic chemical pools. The harsh environment would have killed an ordinary human, but the Primarch thrived, wandering the planet's surface alone until encountering the legendary Silver Worm, a creature of living metal that inhabited Medusa's deepest caverns. Their battle lasted for days until Ferrus finally defeated the beast by drowning it in a lake of molten lava. When he withdrew his arms from the lava, he found them coated in living metal. The worm's substance had bonded with his flesh, giving him hands of living silver. The nomadic clans of Medusa, who had observed the battle from a distance, accepted him as a leader, uniting under his guidance to survive their planet's harsh conditions. On Chagoris, a world of vast plains inhabited by nomadic horse tribes, the pod containing Jagatai Khan landed in the territory of the Talskars. The tribe's leader, Ankhan, adopted the child and named him Jaghatai. The young Primarch quickly adapted to the Talskars' nomadic lifestyle, becoming an exceptional horseman and warrior. When a rival tribe destroyed his adoptive people, Jagatai swore revenge, beginning a campaign that eventually united all the tribes of Chagoris under his leadership. He introduced new military tactics, combining the traditional mounted warfare of the Plains tribes with more sophisticated strategies, creating a mobile force that could outmaneuver any opponent. The polluted hive world of Nostromo, perpetually dark due to its sun's radiation being blocked by industrial pollution, received Conrad Kurz. His pod crashed into the highest spire of Nostromo Quintus, the planet's largest city, creating panic among the ruling elite. Unlike most of his brothers, Kurz received no adoptive family or guidance. He grew in the shadows, learning about humanity by observing the brutal society around him. Nostromo was ruled by criminal cartels that maintained order through fear and violence, with corruption endemic at every level. Kurz decided to fight fire with fire, becoming a vigilante who targeted the criminal overlords with brutal efficiency. His campaign of terror against the guilty transformed Nostromo, as fear of his retribution created a law-abiding society where traditional enforcement had failed. The Emperor, despite the loss of his Primarchs, proceeded with the creation and expansion of the Space Marine Legions. Using the genetic templates derived from each Primarch, he established 20 distinct legions, each inheriting specific traits from their absent gene father. The first founded was the 16th Legion, created from the genetic material of Horus, who would be the first Primarch rediscovered during the Great Crusade. This legion displayed exceptional tactical flexibility and leadership qualities, reflecting the genetic legacy of their Primarch even before meeting him. The creation process for Space Marines was refined during this period, establishing the standard procedure that would be used throughout the Great Crusade. Young male recruits, typically between the ages of 8 and 12, underwent extensive screening to determine genetic compatibility with the specific legion's gene seed. Those who passed initial screening began a series of surgical procedures to implant the 19 organs that would transform them into Astartes. The process began with the secondary heart, providing redundancy for the circulatory system and improving blood flow to enhanced muscles. The os medulla followed, altering bone growth to create the characteristically dense, ceramic-like skeletal structure of a Space Marine. The biscopia enhanced muscle growth, while the hemastamen altered blood composition to improve oxygen carrying capacity and accelerate healing. Each implant built upon the changes introduced by the previous ones, creating a carefully orchestrated transformation from human to transhuman. The most difficult implantations came later in the process, after the recruit's body had adapted to the initial changes. The catalepsian node allowed Marines to function with minimal sleep by letting one hemisphere of the brain rest while the other remained active. The preomner, a pre-stomach that could neutralize toxins, protected Marines from poisoning. The omophagia, the brain eater, allowed Astartes to gain information by consuming the flesh of fallen enemies, a practice that would later develop ritual significance in many legions. The final and most important implant was the black carapace, a subdermal layer that created a neural interface between the Marine's body and his power armor. This symbiotic relationship with their wargear gave Space Marines unprecedented control over their powered suits, making the armor a true second skin rather than merely an encumbrance. Throughout this process, hypno-indoctrination and chemical treatments reinforced the psychological conditioning necessary to create warriors who were both supremely lethal and absolutely loyal. The memories of their previous lives were not erased, but subsumed into their new identity as Astartes, creating warriors who remembered their humanity while transcending its limitations. As the first Space Marine legions reached operational strength, the Emperor assigned each a specific role in the coming Great Crusade based on their inherent tendencies and specialties. The 7th Legion, created from Rogaldorn's genetic template, showed natural aptitude for defensive operations and siege warfare. The 19th Legion, bearing Corvus Corax's genes, displayed exceptional stealth capabilities and skill at rapid strike operations. The 12th Legion, derived from Angron's genetic material, manifested an unmatched ferocity in close combat that made them ideal shock troops. These specializations became more pronounced as each legion developed its own traditions and combat doctrines. Even without their Primarch's direct guidance, the genetic legacy encoded in their gene seed pushed each legion towards certain approaches to warfare. The Emperor encouraged this specialization while ensuring that all legions maintained the tactical flexibility necessary for the diverse challenges they would face during the Great Crusade. Human Astartes officers initially led each legion, individuals selected for their exceptional leadership abilities and compatibility with their legion's gene seed. These officers understood that they were placeholders, destined to surrender command when their Primarch was eventually discovered. This knowledge created a unique dynamic within the early legions, a sense of anticipation and preparation for a leader they had never met but whose genetic legacy they carried in their transformed bodies. The Emperor maintained personal command over all 20 legions during this initial period, directing their training and early combat operations personally. As the Great Crusade prepared to launch beyond the Sol system, he developed a command structure that would allow the legions to operate independently while maintaining overall strategic coherence. This structure would prove crucial in the coming centuries as the Crusade expanded across thousands of light years, requiring decentralized command while preserving unity of purpose. With the Space Marine legions growing in number and capability, and the warp storms continuing to abate, the Emperor stood ready to launch humanity's great reconquest of the stars. The loss of the Primarchs remained a setback, but not an insurmountable one. The Emperor's psychic connection to his gene sons would allow him to locate them as the Crusade expanded, reuniting them with their legions and completing the command structure he had envisioned. The stage was set for humanity's resurgence. The unified forces of Terra and Mars, led by the Emperor and his growing legions of Astartes, prepared to venture into the galaxy. Their mission, to reunite the scattered worlds of mankind under a single authority, reclaim the knowledge lost during the Age of Strife, and secure humanity's place among the stars against all threats, both alien and internal. The Great Crusade would transform the galaxy, establishing an imperium that would endure for millennia, though not in the form its founder had intended. The birth of Slaanesh marked not only the fall of the Eldar, but also, paradoxically, the salvation of humanity. As the newly formed Chaos God consumed the souls of its unwitting creators, the immense psychic disturbance that had manifested as warp storms across the galaxy began to subside. The violent tempests that had isolated human worlds for millennia gradually calmed, like ocean waves settling after a hurricane. This cosmic quieting was not instantaneous, but occurred over several decades as the Immaterium adjusted to the new balance of power among the Chaos Gods. Astropaths on Terra were the first to notice the change. Where once they had encountered impenetrable psychic turbulence when attempting to reach beyond the Sol system, they now found channels of relative calm through which their messages could travel. These channels were tenuous at first, allowing only the strongest and most focused transmissions to reach nearby star systems. A senior astropath named Helio Isindra made the first confirmed contact with a human colony beyond Sol in over 5,000 years, reaching the mining outpost on Proxima Centauri. His message was simple: Terra endures, the Emperor protects, prepare for reunification. The Emperor immediately recognized the strategic importance of this development. He gathered his inner circle, including Malkador the Sigillite and the commanders of his Proto-Astartes legions, to the newly constructed Imperial Palace. There, in a chamber whose walls were lined with star charts dating back to the Dark Age of technology, he outlined his vision for humanity's resurgence. The calming of the warp presented a narrow window of opportunity, a chance to reconnect the scattered fragments of human civilization before they diverged beyond recognition or fell to Xeno's predation. Navigator houses that had maintained their bloodlines throughout the isolation now found themselves in high demand. The Paternova of House Belisarius personally oversaw the selection of navigators for the first expeditionary fleets, choosing those with both exceptional warp sight and the mental resilience necessary for venturing into regions where no human ships had traveled for millennia. These pioneers faced considerable risks, as the newly established warp routes remained unpredictable compared to the well-mapped corridors of the pre-Strife era. The first vessels to leave Sol were not military expeditions, but specialized scout ships designated as Expeditus Imperialis. These craft combined speed with sensor arrays specifically designed to assess the status of human colonies. Each carried a complement of astropaths, tech priests, and diplomatic personnel, alongside a small security detachment of the Emperor's genetically enhanced warriors. Their mission was to make contact, gather intelligence, and prepare the way for the larger forces that would follow. Expeditus Imperialis Vanguard, under the command of Admiral Yu Kaln, departed Terra in 798 M30, making a series of short, cautious warp jumps toward Proxima Centauri. The journey that would have taken mere hours during the dark age of technology required nearly 3 weeks, as the ship's navigator carefully tested the stability of each segment of the route. When the Vanguard finally emerged in the Proxima system, they found a human colony that had survived through extreme isolation protocols. The population had retreated into sealed underground habitats, powered by ancient fusion reactors that had operated continuously for 5 millennia. The Proximan leaders initially responded to Imperial contact with suspicion, having developed a culture built around self-sufficiency and distrust of outsiders. Admiral Kalm demonstrated remarkable patience, establishing an orbital position and maintaining regular Vox communication for nearly a month before the colony permitted a landing party. The breakthrough came when the expedition's senior tech priest recognized the colony's reactor maintenance rituals as corrupted versions of standard Mechanicum procedures. By demonstrating the correct forms and explaining the actual purpose of each step, he gained the trust of the colony's engineer priests, who then advocated for closer cooperation with the Imperial delegation. While the Vanguard established relations with Proxima Centauri, the Emperor personally led a more significant expedition to the Alpha Centauri system. Historical records indicated that this system had maintained one of the most advanced human civilizations outside Sol before the Age of Strife. The Emperor's flagship, the Bucephalus, was accompanied by elements of the 7th Legion Astartes and representatives from the Mechanicum of Mars. This expedition served multiple purposes: to reclaim valuable technology, to demonstrate the Emperor's personal commitment to the Great Crusade, and to establish protocols for integrating rediscovered human worlds into the nascent Imperium. The Alpha Centauri expedition encountered a more complex situation than expected. The system's 3 inhabited planets had maintained interplanetary travel throughout the Age of Strife, but had developed competing political structures. Alpha Centauri Prime was governed by a technocratic council that had preserved considerable Dark Age technology. Alpha Centauri 3 had devolved into a feudal society where control of ancient defense systems determined political power. The orbital habitats around Alpha Centauri B had formed a collective governed by consensus, with each habitat specializing in different aspects of production. Rather than imposing immediate compliance, the Emperor demonstrated the political acumen that complemented his military genius. He spent 3 months in the system, meeting with representatives from each faction and learning about their specific needs and capabilities. The eventual integration agreement acknowledged local autonomy in domestic matters while establishing imperial authority over military forces, interstellar trade, and technological development. This approach would become the template for many future compliances, particularly with human worlds that had maintained relatively advanced civilizations. The success of these initial expeditions accelerated preparations for the Great Crusade proper. On Mars, forges that had been reconsecrated through the Treaty of Olympus Mons now operated at maximum capacity, producing weapons, armor, and void ships according to recovered STC patterns. The massive orbital shipyards above Terra, dormant for millennia, hummed with activity as tech priests and laborers constructed the vessels that would carry humanity back to the stars. The Emperor's attention focused increasingly on military preparations. The Thunder Warriors, who had served as his primary fighting force during the Unification Wars, were reaching the end of their operational lifespans. Their genetically engineered bodies, designed for overwhelming short-term power rather than longevity, began to fail at an accelerating rate. Some developed uncontrollable rages that made them dangers to allies and civilians alike. Others simply collapsed as their enhanced organs shut down, victims of a planned obsolescence built into their creation. The Thunder Warriors' deterioration necessitated the accelerated development of the Legion's Astartes. Unlike their predecessors, the Space Marines were designed for the long campaign ahead, warriors who combined transhuman capabilities with psychological stability and extended lifespans. The first full companies of Space Marines completed their training and augmentation in the hidden facilities beneath the Himalaysian mountains, emerging as a new type of warrior, unlike anything seen since the Dark Age of technology. Each legion developed distinctive characteristics based on the genetic template of their absent Primarch. The 13th Legion, created from Robout Guilliman's gene seed, displayed exceptional organizational abilities and tactical flexibility. The 9th Legion, bearing the genetic legacy of Sanguinius, manifested an unusual combination of martial prowess and artistic sensitivity. The 15th Legion, derived from Magnus the Red's template, showed heightened psychic potential that required specialized training protocols. These traits emerged organically from the gene seed itself, as if the Primarch's personalities were encoded in their very DNA. While the legions prepared for war, the Emperor established the administrative structures necessary to govern an interstellar empire. The Council of Terra expanded to include departments responsible for resource allocation, interstellar commerce, and colonial development. The Officio Administratum took shape as the civil service branch of the Imperium, staffed initially by administrators who had proven their competence during Terra's unification. The Mechanicum representatives on Mars formed the nucleus of what would become the Adeptus Mechanicus, formalizing the relationship between the tech priests and the broader Imperium. Perhaps most significantly, the Emperor began construction of the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that would guide Imperial ships through the warp. This massive project combined architectural grandeur with psychic engineering on an unprecedented scale. At its heart lay a chamber where the Emperor himself would project his psychic presence into the warp, creating a fixed point by which navigators could orient themselves across thousands of light years. The supporting infrastructure included life support systems for thousands of psychers who would amplify and focus the Emperor's power generation facilities drawing energy directly from Terra's core, and defensive systems to protect this vital installation. As these preparations advanced, the expeditionary fleets continued to expand humanity's reconnected sphere. The Segmentum Solar Expedition, comprising over 50 vessels and elements from 3 space marine legions, systematically contacted human worlds within 30 light-years of Sol. They encountered situations ranging from relatively advanced societies that had maintained technological capabilities to feral worlds where humanity had regressed to pre-industrial conditions. In some cases, they found only ruins, silent testimonies to colonies that had faced extinction during the long isolation. The expedition to Sithonia proved particularly significant. This mining world, its surface honeycombed with tunnels from millennia of resource extraction, had devolved into a brutal society of competing gangs. Imperial forces discovered that one leader had recently united these warring factions, a towering figure of extraordinary charisma and tactical brilliance. The Emperor, receiving reports of this warlord's capabilities, immediately diverted his personal attention to Sithonia. There, in the depths of that ravaged world, he found Horus, the first of his scattered Primarchs. The reunion between the Emperor and his gene son became the stuff of Imperial legend. Witnesses described how the two recognized each other instantly despite never having met, how Horus knelt before his creator without hesitation or question, and how the Emperor raised him up as an equal rather than a subject. Within days, Horus had been integrated into the Imperial command structure, assuming leadership of the 16th Legion that bore his genetic legacy. The Legion, already renowned for its effectiveness, reached new levels of excellence under the direct leadership of their Primarch. Horus quickly became the Emperor's right hand, demonstrating not just martial prowess but diplomatic skill and strategic vision. As more expeditionary fleets prepared to depart Sol, the Emperor appointed Horus as War Master of the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, one of the largest and most prestigious commands in the nascent crusade. This assignment served multiple purposes. It gave Horus operational experience at the highest levels, demonstrated the Emperor's confidence in his son, and established a command precedent for the other Primarchs who would eventually be discovered. The final days of the Age of Strife witnessed an accelerating transition from isolation to reconnection, from defense to expansion, from recovery to ambition. The Emperor, seeing the warp route stabilize and his military forces reach operational readiness, formalized his vision in what became known as the Imperial Truth, a philosophical framework emphasizing rational materialism, human potential, and unity under imperial authority. This doctrine explicitly rejected religion, superstition, and the concept of supernatural forces beyond human understanding, a position that would have profound implications as the Imperium encountered the realities of the warp. In a ceremony that marked the official launch of the Great Crusade, the Emperor addressed the assembled commanders of the expeditionary fleets from the steps of the newly completed Eternity Gate of the Imperial Palace. He spoke not just to those physically present, but through a coordinated astropathic broadcast to all human worlds that had been reconnected to the Imperium. His message was one of determined optimism. Humanity would reclaim its birthright among the stars, reunite its scattered children, and forge a future free from the ignorance and division that had nearly destroyed the species. As the first major wave of expeditionary fleets departed Terra, they carried with them not just the military might of the Imperium, but its underlying purpose. Each fleet included not only space marines and army regiments, but mechanicum representatives seeking lost technology, administratum officials to establish governance structures, iterators to spread the imperial truth, and remembrancers to document humanity's reconquest of the galaxy. This comprehensive approach reflected the Emperor's vision of the Great Crusade as not merely a military campaign, but a civilizational project, the rebirth of humanity as an interstellar species united under a single authority. The Age of Strife had lasted for nearly 5 millennia, a period of darkness, isolation, and regression that had nearly extinguished the flame of human civilization. Its end marked the beginning of humanity's second chance, an opportunity to rebuild what had been lost and to create new glories that would surpass even the achievements of the Dark Age of technology. As the Great Crusade gathered momentum, expanding outward from Terra in all directions, the Emperor's vision seemed within reach. A human empire spanning the galaxy, free from the threats of Xeno's aggression, warp predation, and internal division. Yet even as humanity looked forward with renewed hope, the seeds of future conflict had already been sown. The Primarchs, scattered across the galaxy by forces that understood the Emperor's plans all too well, had developed in environments their creator never intended. The Chaos Gods, having failed to prevent the Emperor's rise on Terra, now turned their attention to corrupting his greatest creations. And the Imperial truth, for all its rational appeal, denied realities of the warp that would eventually demand acknowledgement. The Great Crusade would indeed transform the galaxy, but not entirely as its architect had planned.